Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, settle into where you are, and let the shoulders soften a little. There is no hurry tonight, and nothing here that asks anything of you. Tonight we begin in a small shop on a narrow lane in an old European town, on a cold night many hundreds of years ago. Imagine for a moment the close of a long winter day. Somewhere in the middle of the long stretch of years we now call the Middle Ages, when the cathedrals were rising slowly stone by stone, and the monks copied their books by hand in the cold scriptorium, and the lanes of the town were narrow and dark, and smelled of wood smoke and wet straw. The light is going. The last of the day has gone grey and blue beyond the small horn windows, and the first frost is settling on the thatch. A small shop stands at the corner of the lane, where the apothecary keeps his trade. Above the door hangs a painted board, worn by the weather, showing a green sprig of herbs and a small brass mortar. The shutters are half drawn against the cold, and within, a single tallow candle burns upon the counter, and a low fire glows red upon the hearth. Inside, the apothecary, an old man with a careful face and very still hands, sits upon his stool by the fire. Behind him, on a long shelf of dark oak, stand the small jars and pots of his cupboard, some of glazed earthenware, some of clear green glass, some of plain wood, each labelled in a careful brown ink upon a small strip of parchment. There is a great brass mortar upon the counter, worn bright with use, and a set of small balances hanging from a hook, and bundles of dried herbs hanging head down from the dark beams of the low ceiling, so that the whole small room smells of dust and dried flowers and the slow sweet smoke of the fire. The lane outside is quiet, save for the soft step of two travellers coming in out of the cold. One is a carter, a broad man in a heavy woolen cloak white with frost, come a long way along the frozen road with an empty cart and a tired horse. The other is a young mother of the town, her small child wrapped close against her in a shawl, the child flushed and fretful with a winter fever. They push open the low door, and the warm air and the soft candlelight fall upon their faces, and they sigh in the way travellers sigh when they have come in at last from the long cold night. The apothecary rises in his slow careful way and bids them sit by the fire, and sets a small iron pot of water upon the embers to warm. He lifts down a jar from the shelf and shakes out a small handful of dried leaves into a wooden bowl, and the soft scent of the dried herb rises into the warm air of the room. The candle flickers, the fire settles, the frost gathers on the small window panes. That is where I would like to begin. There, in that small warm room, on that long cold night, with the candle burning low upon the counter, and the dried herbs hanging from the dark beams, and the kettle just beginning to warm upon the embers. Tonight we will walk together through 100 small facts about the herbal medicine of the European Middle Ages. 100 quiet pieces of old lore, told one at a time, each in its quiet turn, gathered from the long careful tradition of the monastery garden, and the wise woman's cottage, and the apothecary's shop. We will start with the gentlest and most familiar, the walled gardens of the monks, and the old theory of the 4 Humours, and walk slowly outward from there. We will pass through the great old books of herbs, the leech books and the herbals, and the plants of every common garden, and the women healers and the wise women of the villages, and the apothecary's shop and its guilds, and the careful gathering and drying of the herbs. and the curious old doctrine of signatures, and the remedies against the great plague, and the gentle herbs for sleep and for pain, and the herbs for the heart and the stomach, and the dangerous plants used with the most careful hand, and the herbs that lived a double life in the kitchen and the sick room. And at the last we will follow the quiet thread of all this old lore, where it runs, unbroken, into the medicine of the present day. That is the pace I would like to keep tonight. Slow, even, steady as soft snow falling in the dark beyond the window. Settle in. There is nothing here that asks for hurry, and nothing here that asks anything of you. There will be no quiz at the end. You do not need to remember a single one of these 100 facts. Let them drift past like the slow smoke of the fire, and let the body grow quiet at its own slow pace. And if your eyes should close somewhere in the first dozen, that is exactly as it should be. The 100 facts will go on softly whether you are listening or no. Before we turn to the first of them, let us pause a little while in the shop itself and look around us, that we may know where we are and how the people of those far-off days thought about the herbs and the healing of the body. The herbal medicine of the Middle Ages was not the medicine of the modern hospital, with its bright lights and its clear glass and its careful science. It was an older thing, a slower thing, a thing made of the garden and the kitchen and the prayer and the quiet patience of long observation. It lived in many places at once. It lived in the walled gardens of the great monasteries, where the monks grew the healing herbs in careful raised beds and tended the sick of the countryside in the long stone infirmary. It lived in the cottage of the wise woman of the village, who knew the plants of the hedgerow and the wood, and who came when a child was ill or a woman was in labor or an old man could not sleep. It lived in the still room of the great manor house, where the lady of the household kept her own careful book of receipts, copied in her own hand, of the syrups and the conserves and the waters she made from the herbs of her own garden. And it lived, at the last, in the small dark shop of the town apothecary, where the dried herbs and the costly spices and the strange compounded medicines were kept in their rows of small, labeled jars. All of this healing rested upon an old theory of the body, inherited from the physicians of ancient Greece and Rome, and carried down through the long centuries by the careful copying hand of the monk and the Arab scholar. It was the theory of the 4 humours. The people of the Middle Ages believed that the body was made of 4 fluids, 4 humours, and that health was the gentle balance of the 4, and sickness, the falling out of balance of one or another. The 4 were the blood, the phlegm, the yellow bile, and the black bile, and we will come to them gently in their own chapter, for they governed everything. And a herb was chosen, not for what we would now call its chemistry, but for whether it was reckoned hot or cold, wet or dry, and so for whether it could set right the humour that had fallen out of true. The knowledge of all this was kept in books. Some were very old, copied and recopied from the writings of the ancient world, from the great Greek physician Dioscorides, who had written his book of plants in the 1st century after Christ, and from Galen of Pergamon, who came a little after him, and whose theories ruled the medicine of Europe for more than 1,000 years. Some were newer, written in the monasteries and the schools of the Middle Ages themselves, in the old English leech books and the herbals of the European cloisters, And we will come to those books too, gently, in their turn, for they are among the most beautiful things this long tradition left behind. The great illuminated herbals with their careful, painted plants upon the parchment page. And the knowledge was kept, too, in the people. In the slow, careful memory of the herb, wife and the monk, and the apothecary, passed down by word and by hand, mother to daughter and master to apprentice, through the long unrecorded centuries, in a quiet chain of remembering that reaches, in its own strange way, all the way down to the present day, to the chamomile tea upon the modern kitchen shelf, and the small white pill of aspirin in the modern cupboard, both of which, as we shall see at the very end of our long walk tonight, began in the medieval garden. A short and gentle word before we begin about what was true in all this and what was not. The medieval herbalists got a great deal wrong. They believed in the 4 humours which do not exist. They believed that the shape of a plant revealed its use, which is mostly not so. They mixed the good herb with the useless charm, the true remedy with the hopeful prayer, and could not always tell which was which. And yet they also got a great deal right, more than we sometimes remember. They knew the willow bark for pain, and the foxglove, used most carefully, for the failing heart, and the poppy for sleep, and the meadowsweet for fever, and 100 other things besides, that the modern science of medicine, coming slowly along behind them, would one day confirm with all its careful instruments. So we will not laugh at them tonight, and we will not scold them. We will simply walk with them a little way, through their walled gardens and their candlelit shops, and listen to what they believed, and let the old lore drift past us in the warm dark, the true with the false, the wise with the hopeful, as gently as the smoke that rises from the apothecary's fire. The water in the small iron pot is warm now. The apothecary lifts it from the embers and pours it slowly over the dried leaves in the wooden bowl, and the soft steam rises into the candlelight. The young mother holds her fretful child a little closer to the warmth of the fire. The carter stretches his cold hands toward the embers and lets out a long, slow breath. The candle flickers and steadies and burns on. Let us turn now to the first of our 100 facts, and let us begin, as the whole of this long tradition began, in the walled garden of the monastery, behind the high stone wall, where the monks grew their healing herbs in the careful quiet of the cloister. The first fact is this: the great medical gardens of medieval Europe were grown, for the most part, not by physicians, but by monks. In the long centuries after the fall of Rome, when the cities had shrunk and the old learning had grown thin upon the ground, it was the monasteries that kept the knowledge of the healing herbs alive. Behind their high walls, in the quiet of the cloister, the monks copied the old books of medicine by hand and grew the herbs those books described in careful walled gardens, and tended the sick who came to their gates. For many hundreds of years, if you fell ill in the European countryside and could not be healed by the wise woman of your own village, it was to the monastery you would go, and it was a monk in a brown or a black robe, with earth beneath his fingernails and a knowledge of herbs in his slow, careful head, who would tend you. The second fact is this: the plan of the ideal monastery garden has come down to us, almost by a miracle, from the early 9th century, in a great drawing upon parchment that we now call the Plan of St. Gall. It was made around the year 820, and it survives still, kept safe in the library of the old abbey of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland. It is a careful drawing of an ideal monastery, never quite built as drawn, but showing all the parts a great abbey should have, and among them, drawn small and careful in one corner, is the physic garden, the herb garden of the infirmary, with 16 long raised beds, and beside each bed, written in a careful Latin hand, the name of the herb that should grow there: rose and lily, sage and rue, cumin and fennel and rosemary, and a dozen more besides. It is the oldest plan of a medicinal garden that survives in all of Europe, and from it we know, 1,000 years and more after the ink was dry, exactly what the monks of that far-off age believed a healing garden should hold. The third fact is this: the herb garden of the monastery had its own particular name. It was called the Herbularius, the place of the little herbs, and it was kept quite separate from the kitchen garden, which was called the Hortus, where the cabbages and the leeks and the beans were grown for the table. The Herbularius was the garden of medicine, set close beside the infirmary, where the sick lay, so that the infirmer monk, the brother whose whole task was the care of the sick, might step out from the bedside and into the garden, and gather what he needed fresh, and carry it back within, still cool and damp from the morning dew. The two gardens, the herb garden of healing and the kitchen garden of food, lay side by side within the same high walls, and between them, very often, lay a third, the small garden of the cemetery, planted with fruit trees, where the brothers were buried at the last beneath the apple boughs. Healing and food and the long rest at the end, all three gardens together within the one quiet wall. Let us linger a moment longer in that walled garden before we go on, for it is the quiet root from which the whole of our long evening grows, and it is worth seeing clearly in the mind. Picture it, then, in the soft grey light of an early summer morning, 1,000 years ago. The high stone wall runs all around, keeping out the wind and the wandering beast and the eyes of the world. Within, the narrow gravel paths divide the raised beds into their neat green squares, and in each square the herbs grow thick and ordered. The tall fennel and the silver wormwood, the grey-green sage and the dark spires of the rosemary, the low creeping thyme and the soft mounds of the chamomile. A small fountain or a stone basin may stand at the crossing of the paths, where the water is drawn for the herbs and where the birds come down to drink in the cool of the day. And over it all hangs the deep quiet of the cloister, broken only by the slow ringing of the bell that calls the brothers to their prayers, and the soft drone of the bees moving from flower to flower in the warming air. Into this garden in the first cool of the morning comes the brother whose task it is to tend it, his brown or his black robe gathered up at the waist, a flat basket upon his arm, and a small curved knife at his belt. He moves slowly down the paths, bending here to draw a weed, pausing there to break off a sprig of the sage, or to cut a handful of the betony, laying each gathered herb gently in the basket as he goes. He knows every plant in the garden by name, and by nature knows which is for the head, and which for the stomach, which is hot, and which is cold, which must be gathered now in the morning, and which must wait for the autumn. He has tended this garden for 30 years, perhaps, or for 40, and his hands know the work without his thinking of it, and his mind, as he gathers, is half upon the herbs and half upon his quiet prayers, the two woven together as naturally as the warp and the weft of a single cloth. This is the heart of the matter, and it is worth holding for a moment. For these monks did not draw the line, as we so sharply draw it, between the work of the hands and the work of the soul. To tend the garden was a prayer. To gather the herbs was a prayer. To carry the warm drink to the sick brother in the long night was a prayer, and the highest kind, for it was service to one in need. The care of the body and the care of the soul flowed together in the long ordered days of the monastery, and the herb garden stood at the very center of that gentle weaving, the place where the green growing world and the world of prayer and the world of healing all met and were one. When we speak tonight of medieval herbalism, this is the deep, quiet ground on which the whole of it first grew, the walled garden in the grey morning, the slow monk with his basket, the bees, the bell, and the herbs growing thick and ordered in their neat green beds behind the high protecting wall. And it endured. That is the wonder of it. While the kingdoms rose and fell beyond the wall, while the armies marched and the cities burned, and the great chaos of the early Middle Ages swept back and forth across the land, behind the high stone wall of the monastery the herbs were tended, and the books were copied, and the sick were healed, year upon year, century upon century, in a quiet that the storms of the world could not quite reach. For 500 years and more, the monastery garden was the safe green ark in which the old knowledge of healing rode out the long dark flood. And when at last the cities grew again, and the universities rose, and the apothecaries opened their shops in the towns, it was from the monastery garden that the seed of all of it came, carried out over the wall at last into the wider world. We owe more than we know, all of us, to those slow patient brothers and their walled green gardens, and it is right, before we go further, to bow our heads to them a moment in the quiet, and then to go gently on. The fourth fact is this: the care of the herb garden and the care of the sick fell, in most monasteries, to a single brother, and his title was the infirmary. He was the monk who kept the infirmary, the long stone room where the sick brothers and the sick travellers lay upon their narrow beds. It was his task to know the herbs, to gather them and dry them and keep them, to make the syrups and the salves and the warm drinks, and to sit by the bedside in the long night and tend the fevered and the dying. He was, in the truest sense, the physician of the house, though he had no degree from any university and called himself by no proud name. He was simply the brother who knew the herbs, and who rose in the dark and the cold of the winter night to bring a warm drink to a brother who could not sleep. There is something very gentle in the thought of him, going softly along the cold stone passage with a small lamp in his hand and a warm cup of betony or chamomile, to sit a while by the bed of one who was afraid. The fifth fact is this: the herbs of the monastery garden were not chosen by the monks alone, but were, in a sense, decreed from the very top of the kingdom. Around the year 800, the great Emperor Charlemagne, who ruled over much of Western Europe, set down a long list of instructions for the running of his royal estates in a document we now call the Capitulaire de Villis, the chapter concerning the estates. And in it, among the rules for the keeping of the barns and the mills and the fish ponds, he set down a list of the plants that he wished to see grown in every garden of his realm. There are some 73 herbs upon the list, and 4 kinds of tree, and it reads like a small map of the whole medieval garden. Lily and rose, fenugreek and cumin, rosemary and sage, rue and fennel and mint, and a long quiet roll of others besides. The monasteries took the list to heart and grew what the emperor had named, and so it came about that the same herbs grew in walled gardens from the cold north of Germany to the warm south of France. All of them descended, in a manner of speaking, from one old list written down by a king who could barely write his own name. The 6th fact is this: within the herb garden, the plants were not grown in the open ground, but in raised beds, long narrow rectangles of earth held up by low boards or low walls of woven wattle, so that the soil within stood a little higher than the path. There were good reasons for this, and they are the same reasons a careful gardener might choose a raised bed today. The raised soil drained more freely, so that the roots of the herbs did not stand in the cold wet of the winter. The raised bed warmed more quickly in the spring sun, and the gardener might reach the plants without stepping upon the soil and pressing it hard. The beds were narrow, no wider than a monk could reach across from the path on either side, so that no part of the bed was ever trodden, and the dark earth stayed soft and open for the slow, careful roots. When you see, in the old paintings, the small square gardens of the medieval cloister, divided into their neat raised beds by narrow gravel paths, you are seeing a piece of practical wisdom that has lasted in the gardens of the present day, almost entirely unchanged. The 7th fact is this: many of the herbs of the monastery garden were grown not only for the body, but for the altar. The same garden that supplied the infirmary supplied the church. The lily and the rose were grown for the feast days of the Virgin, to be laid upon the altar and carried in the slow processions. The fragrant herbs, the rosemary and the southernwood and the lavender, were grown to be strewn upon the cold stone floor of the church on the great feast days, so that the feet of the brothers, passing slowly to and fro, might crush them and release their sweet scent into the cold air. And certain herbs were grown for the making of the holy oils and the incense, and certain others for the dyeing of the cloth and the making of the inks with which the brothers copied their books. The garden was a garden of many uses, the herb of healing growing in the next bed to the herb of the altar and the herb of the ink pot, all of them tended by the same slow, careful hand. The 8th fact is this, and with it we will leave the monastery garden and pass on. The greatest of all the medieval writers on the herbs of the garden was not a monk at all, but a nun. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and she lived in the 12th century in a convent upon the river Rhine in Germany, and she was one of the most remarkable people of the whole Middle Ages. She was an abbess, a composer of music, a writer of visions, a counselor of bishops and emperors, and, among all else, a careful student of the healing herbs. She wrote a book of natural medicine, which we now call the Physica, in which she set down, plant by plant and stone by stone, the healing virtues of the things of the German countryside, the fennel and the chestnut and the violet, and a great many more, often with shrewd and sensible advice, and sometimes with the strangest of fancies. She wrote in a voice all her own, plain and confident and deeply observant, and her book is one of the very few medieval works on herbs written by a woman whose name we know, and whose voice still comes through to us, clear and quiet, across the 800 years between us. There is one more thing worth saying before we move on, for the next chapter is the strange old heart of the whole tradition. All the herbs of all those gardens, the rose and the rue and the fennel and the sage, were chosen and given according to one great old theory of how the body worked. It was the theory of the 4 humours, and it is so strange to the modern ear, and yet was held so deeply for so long, that it deserves a quiet chapter of its own. Let us turn to it now, and let us not trouble to remember any of it, for it is wrong in almost every part. And yet it is the doorway through which we must pass to understand everything that follows. Let us turn now to the 4 humours. The 9th fact is this: the whole of medieval medicine rested upon the belief that the human body was made of 4 fluids, and that all health and all sickness flowed from the balance or the imbalance of these 4. They were called the humours from the Latin word for moisture, and they were the blood, the phlegm, the yellow bile, and the black bile. The blood was thought to be made in the liver, and to carry warmth and life. The phlegm was the cool watery fluid of the head and the chest, that ran from the nose in a cold, and gathered in the lungs. The yellow bile, or choler, was the bitter yellow fluid of the gall, thought to gather in fevers and in anger. And the black bile, the strangest of the 4, was a dark and cold and dry humour thought to be made in the spleen, and to gather in the autumn, and to bring on the heaviness of spirit we still, to this very day, call melancholy, which is simply the old Greek word for black bile. 4 fluids. The body was a vessel that held them, and the healer's whole task was to keep them in their gentle balance, one against another, like 4 streams feeding one quiet pool. The 10th fact is this: to each of the 4 humours belonged a pair of qualities, drawn from the 2 great pairs of opposites, by which the medieval mind understood the whole of the physical world. The first pair was hot and cold. The second pair was wet and dry. And every humour, and indeed every herb, and every food, and every part of the year, was reckoned to be some blend of these. The blood was hot and wet, like the warm moist air of the spring. The yellow bile was hot and dry, like the parched heat of the summer. The black bile was cold and dry, like the bare brown earth of the autumn. And the phlegm was cold and wet, like the long grey damp of the winter. So the 4 humours answered to the 4 seasons of the year, and to the 4 ages of a human life: the hot moist blood of childhood, the hot dry choler of youth, the cold dry melancholy of middle years, and the cold wet phlegm of old age, when the body grows slow and damp and cool. It was a great and beautiful and entirely mistaken system, in which everything answered to everything else, and the small body of a single sick child was bound by 1,000 invisible threads to the great wheel of the turning seasons and the turning sky. The 11th fact is this: because of all this, a person's whole character, the cast of their mind and the colour of their mood, was thought to come from which of the 4 humours ran strongest in them. And we still use the old words today, long after we have forgotten what they meant. A person in whom the blood ran strong was called sanguine, from the Latin word for blood, and was thought to be warm and cheerful, and quick to laugh, and quick to love. A person ruled by the yellow bile was called choleric, and was thought to be hot and quick to anger, fierce and ambitious, and easily moved to rage. A person ruled by the cold wet phlegm was called phlegmatic, and was thought to be calm and slow and patient and hard to stir. And a person in whom the dark, cold, black bile ran strong was called melancholic, and was thought to be thoughtful and sorrowful, and given to long brooding and deep feeling. Sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, melancholic. 4 words we still use, the worn old coins of a forgotten science, passed from hand to hand for so long that we have quite forgotten the king whose face they once bore. The 12th fact is this. Once the healer had decided which humour had fallen out of balance in the sick person, the cure followed by a simple and pleasing logic. Like was not cured by like, but by its opposite. The principle was set down in 3 Latin words, contraria contrarius curantur, opposites are cured by opposites. If a person burned with a hot dry fever, which was an excess of the hot dry yellow bile, then they were given cooling and moistening herbs to set it right, the cool cucumber, the cooling lettuce, the moist mallow. If a person was sunk in the cold, wet heaviness of too much phlegm, with a streaming cold and a chest full of damp, then they were given hot and drying herbs, the warm ginger, the hot pepper, the drying sage. Every herb in the apothecary's cupboard was reckoned as hot or cold, wet or dry, and the healing of a body was, in theory, a simple matter of balancing the scales, of adding warmth where there was too much cold, and moisture where there was too much dryness, until the 4 humours came back into their gentle and life-giving balance. The 13th fact is this. The herbs themselves were sorted not only into hot and cold, wet and dry, but into degrees of each, and this is one of the most curious refinements of the whole old theory. A herb was reckoned to be hot, or cold, or wet, or dry, in the 1st degree, or the 2nd, or the 3rd, or the 4th. The 1st degree was the gentlest, a warmth or a coolness so slight you might hardly feel it. The 4th degree was the most violent, a heat or a cold strong enough to be a danger. Mild lettuce was cold in the 2nd degree, a gentle cooling herb fit for a feverish child. But the burning pepper was hot in the 4th degree, a fierce and powerful thing to be used with the most careful hand. The poppy was cold in the 3rd or the 4th degree, cold enough to bring on the deep sleep, cold enough in too great a dose to bring on the sleep from which there is no waking. So the apothecary, weighing out his herbs, was weighing not only their kind but their strength, balancing a strong heat against a strong cold, a gentle warmth against a gentle damp, like a careful cook seasoning a great slow pot. The 14th fact is this. Even the time of day and the turning of the stars were drawn into the healing. The medieval healer believed that the body, the humours, and the heavens above were all bound together, and that the great wheel of the zodiac, the 12 signs through which the sun and the moon and the planets moved, ruled over the 12 parts of the body, each sign over its own part. There survives, in many old medical manuscripts, a strange and striking picture we now call the Zodiac Man, or the Man of Signs. It is a drawing of a naked man, standing with his arms a little spread, and around him and upon him are set the 12 signs of the Zodiac, each touching the part of the body it was thought to govern. The ram, Aries, ruled the head. The bull, Taurus, ruled the neck and the throat. The twins ruled the arms and the shoulders, and so down the whole length of the body, sign by sign, to the fishes, Pisces, who ruled the feet. The healer would not let blood from a part of the body when the moon was passing through the sign that ruled it, lest the flow could not be stopped, and would not gather certain herbs or give certain medicines save when the moon and the stars stood right. It was an astonishing tangle of the body and the heavens, and it bound the smallest ache of the smallest finger to the slow majestic wheeling of the whole night sky. The 15th fact is this: the balancing of the humours was done not only by herbs, but by the great and dreaded practice of bloodletting, the deliberate opening of a vein to let out a measured quantity of blood. To the medieval mind this made perfect sense. If sickness came from an excess of a humour, and the blood was the most easily reached of all the humours, then to let out a little blood was to let out a little of the excess, and so to bring the body back toward its balance. Bloodletting was done for almost everything, for fevers and for headaches, for melancholy and for fullness of the blood, and was done even by the healthy at certain seasons of the year, as a kind of spring cleaning of the body. It was very often the barber who did it, the same man who cut the hair and trimmed the beard, for he had the sharp blades and the steady hand, and the old red and white striped pole that still hangs to this very day outside the barber's shop is a faded memory of those far-off days, the red for the blood and the white for the bandage. The herbs we speak of tonight were the gentler side of medieval healing. The lancet and the leech were the harder side, and they stood, always, just behind the herb jar on the shelf. The 16th fact is this, and with it we will leave the 4 humours and pass gently on. Strange and mistaken as the whole theory was, it was not without its quiet wisdom, and it held one truth that we have perhaps half forgotten in our own age. It held that the healer must treat the whole person, and not the disease alone, because every body was thought to have its own particular balance of the humours, its own complexion, as they called it. The same illness in 2 different people might be treated quite differently, the one with cooling herbs and the other with warming, according to the nature of each. The medieval healer looked at the whole person before them, their age, their colour, their temper, the season of the year, the very stars under which they were born, and shaped the remedy to the whole. The theory beneath it was wrong, almost entirely wrong, and yet the instinct above it, that the sick person is a whole human being and not merely a broken part, was a gentle and a humane one, and it is, perhaps, the one piece of the old 4 humours that we might still, with profit, carry quietly forward into our own time. Let us turn now to the great old books of herbs. The 17th fact is this: the oldest book of medicine in the English language is a thing of the 10th century, and it carries one of the gentlest names of any book I know. It is called Bald's Leech Book. The word leech, in those old days, had nothing to do with the small dark creature of the pond. It came from an old word that meant simply a healer, and a leech book was a book of healing, a book of remedies, and Bald was the name of the man who owned the book, or had it made, for there is a small verse written into it that says, in the Old English, that Bald owns this book, which he ordered a scribe named Sild to write. So it comes down to us with the names of 2 long-dead men woven into it, Bald who wished it made, and Sild who made it. Bending over the parchment, in some cold scriptorium more than 1,000 years ago, and it is the oldest surviving book of medicine in any of the languages of Northern Europe. The 18th fact is this: Bald's Leech Book holds, among its many remedies, one that has astonished the modern world. It is a recipe for an eye salve, a remedy for an infection of the eye. made of garlic and onion or leek, pounded together with wine and the bile from the stomach of an ox, and left to stand in a brass vessel for 9 nights before it is used. For long years this was thought to be no more than another piece of medieval folly. But not many years ago, a group of modern scientists, half in curiosity and half in jest, made up the salve exactly as the old book describes, with the same ingredients and the same brass vessel and the same 9 nights of waiting, and tested it against one of the most stubborn and dangerous bacteria known to modern medicine, the kind that resists our strongest drugs. And to their great surprise, the 1,000-year-old recipe killed it, where many a modern medicine had failed. No one is quite sure why. Perhaps it is the garlic, perhaps the copper salts drawn from the brass, perhaps the slow 9 nights of fermenting, perhaps all of them together. But it is a quiet and humbling thing to find that an old monk's recipe for sore eyes, written down before the Norman conquest of England, could do what our brightest laboratories sometimes cannot. The 19th fact is this. Beside Bald's Leech Book, there survives another old English book, stranger and older in feeling, which we now call the Lacnunga, a word that means simply remedies. It is a gathering of charms and recipes and prayers, copied down around the year 1000, and it stands with one foot in the world of the herb garden, and the other in the old half-forgotten world of pagan magic. In it the herbs are mixed with chanted charms, and holy words and small rituals, and the most famous piece of it is a thing called the 9 herbs charm, an old verse that names 9 sacred herbs, the mugwort and the plantain and the watercress and the rest, and praises each in turn for its power against poison and sickness, and the flying venoms that were thought to bring disease through the air. It is half medicine and half poetry, and half prayer, which is 1/2 too many, and yet that is exactly the truth of it, for in those old days the 3 were not yet pulled apart, and the herb and the charm and the prayer were spoken together over the sick in one long quiet breath. The 20th fact is this. There was an old book of herbs that travelled across nearly the whole of medieval Europe, copied and recopied in country after country. And it was so old that even the medieval scribes thought it ancient. It was called the Herbarium, and it was attributed to a writer the Middle Ages called Apuleius Platonicus, though who he truly was no one now knows. It described some 130 plants, with a small picture of each, and the ailments each could cure, and it was translated even into the Old English tongue, so that there survives an Old English herbarium, one of the earliest illustrated books of plants in any European language. Turning its pages, you see the medieval scribes' careful painted plants, the betony and the plantain and the henbane, drawn sometimes from life, and sometimes copied so many times from older copies that the plant has grown strange and stylized. A green dream of a plant rather than the plant itself, the leaves curled into patterns no leaf ever wore, the root drawn like a small sleeping animal beneath the soil. The 21st fact is this. The illuminated herbals of the Middle Ages are among the most beautiful books that age produced, and they were made with enormous care and at enormous cost. To make one, a scribe must first prepare the parchment, the scraped and smoothed skin of a calf or a sheep or a goat, for paper had not yet come to Europe. Then the text must be copied out by hand, letter by letter, in the careful script of the age. Then the spaces left for the plants must be filled by the painter. who ground his own colours from earth and stone and plant, and even from costly things brought half across the world. The deep blue from a stone called lapis lazuli that came only from the far mountains of Afghanistan. The bright gold from beaten leaves of true gold. A single great herbal might take a year or more of patient work, and might cost as much as a small farm, and might be chained to its shelf in the library, so that no one could carry it off. To turn the pages of such a book, even now, even behind glass in a quiet museum, is to feel the weight of all those slow, careful hours, and all those long dead, patient hands. The 22nd fact is this. There was a herbal written all in verse, so that it might be the more easily remembered, and it was one of the most popular medical books of the entire Middle Ages. It was called Mesa Floridus, or simply the Mesa, and it set out the virtues of some 70 and more herbs in flowing Latin verse, the betony and the rue and the wormwood, and the rest, each in its own little poem. The thought behind it was a kindly one. A student or a monk who could not always have the great books at hand might learn the verses by heart, and carry the whole of a herbal in his head, and call up the virtue of any plant, simply by reciting its little poem to himself as he walked in the garden. There is a gentle wisdom in that, to set the knowledge to a rhythm, so that the memory might hold it, the same wisdom that sets the alphabet to a tune for a small child. And the medieval student, murmuring the virtues of betony in soft Latin verse as he weeded the herb bed, was using one of the oldest tricks of the human memory there is. The 23rd fact is this. There was a beautiful kind of medieval book, made chiefly in Italy, called the Tacuinum Sanitatis, the Tables of Health, and it was less a herbal than a kind of illustrated handbook of healthy living. It came through the Arab physicians from an older Arabic work, and it set out with a large and lovely painting on every page, the good and the bad of all the things of daily life, the foods and the herbs and the seasons, and the very airs and weathers. Here is a painting of a man and a woman gathering ripe cherries from a tree, and beside it a note of whether cherries are hot or cold, and what they are good for, and what harm they may do, and how that harm may be set right. Here is the gathering of the grapes, the cutting of the wheat, the drawing of the water from the well, the cool of the shade and the warmth of the fire, each with its small wise note. The Tacuinum is one of the warmest and most human of all the medieval medical books, full of the small green ordinary life of the medieval year. And through its painted pages, we can almost walk into the medieval garden in the soft light of an Italian afternoon, 600 years ago. The 24th fact is this. Almost everything the medieval herbalist knew rested, in the end, upon two ancient books that were already old when the Middle Ages began. The first was the work of a Greek physician named Dioscorides, who served as a surgeon in the armies of Rome in the 1st century after Christ, and who wrote a great book on the medicines drawn from plants, which we call by its Greek name, De Materia Medica, on the matter of medicine. In it he described some 600 plants and their uses, set down from his own careful observation as he travelled with the armies, and his book remained the chief authority on the healing herbs for more than 1500 years, copied and translated and recopied from the 1st century all the way down into the age of printing. There can be very few books in all the history of the world that have been so trusted by so many for so long. The medieval monk in his cold scriptorium, copying out the virtues of a plant, was very often copying, at one remove or 20, the careful words of a Greek army surgeon who had gathered that same plant on a hillside 15 centuries before. The 25th fact is this, and with it we will close the chapter of the books. The careful copying of the old medical books by hand in the cold monasteries, century after century, is the slender thread by which the whole knowledge of the ancient world was carried across the long dark gap between the fall of Rome and the rise of the universities. Had the monks not copied, the books would have crumbled and been lost, and the knowledge with them. Every old herbal that survives today survives because some unknown brother, in some cold stone room, on some forgotten winter morning, dipped his pen and bent his back and copied it out once more, that it might not perish. We did not know their names. They did not write them down. They thought the work, and not the worker, was what mattered. But every time a modern scholar opens a medieval herbal and reads the careful virtue of an ancient plant, they are reading the work of those nameless, patient hands, reaching out of the silence of 1,000 years to pass the green knowledge gently on. There is one more thing worth saying before we move on, and it is simply this. We have spoken so far of theory and of books. Let us turn now to the plants themselves, to the green living things in the garden, and begin with the ones you may very well have growing in your own. Let us turn now to the familiar plants of the garden. The 26th fact is this. Of all the herbs of the medieval garden, none was more honored than the common sage, the grey-green, leafed plant of the kitchen border that you may have growing outside your own door. Its very name, in the Latin, is salvia, and it comes from the word salvare, to be saved or to be in health, the same root that gives us the words salvation and salve. The medieval herbalist held the sage in such esteem that there was an old saying, repeated all across Europe in many tongues, which asked, "Why should a man die who has sage growing in his garden?" The leaf was given for almost everything, for a sore throat and a weak stomach, for a failing memory and a trembling hand, for the easing of the grief of a mother who had lost her child, and for the long quiet keeping of the body into old age. It was a herb of warmth and of long life, and the monks grew it in great quantity, and the wise women dried it in their lofts, and the old people of the village drank it as a warm tea on the cold mornings of the winter, and felt the better for it, and were perhaps not wrong. The 27th fact is this. The rosemary, the dark fragrant evergreen shrub of the warm southern gardens, was the herb of memory above all others, and it has carried that meaning down so faithfully through the centuries that it is spoken at funerals to this very day. There is rosemary, says a grieving girl in an old play of Shakespeare. That is for remembrance. The medieval herbalist believed that the scent of rosemary woke and strengthened the memory, and students were counseled to set a sprig of it among their books, and to wear it about the head when they sat their examinations. It was burned in the sick room to cleanse the air, and laid among the linen to keep it sweet and free of moth, and carried by mourners at a burial and cast into the open grave, that the dead might be remembered. It was a herb that bound together the keeping of the mind and the keeping of the dead, the remembering of one's lessons and the remembering of one's lost, and through all of it ran that one dark, fragrant, evergreen scent, sharp and clean and a little sad. the very smell of remembrance itself. The 28th fact is this: the lavender of the medieval garden, the silver-leafed shrub with its soft purple flowers and its clean sweet scent, took its very name from the act of washing. The word lavender comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, for the Romans had cast the flowers into their baths, and the medieval people laid the dried flowers among their washed linen in the great oak chests of the manor house, so that the clean cloth came out smelling of summer all the winter long. The herb was held to calm and to soothe, to ease the aching head and to settle the troubled spirit, and a small bag of the dried flowers was tucked beneath the pillow of one who could not sleep. It is one of the gentle herbs whose old reputation has lasted almost unchanged into the present day, for the lavender on the modern pillow and the lavender oil rubbed upon the modern temple do exactly what the medieval herb wife meant them to do, and we trust them for exactly the reasons she did, though we have nearly forgotten that she is the one who taught us. The 29th fact is this: the small white and gold flower of the camomile that grows low upon the ground and smells, when it is crushed underfoot, of ripe apples, was one of the great calming herbs of the medieval garden, and it was grown not only in the bed, but in the path itself. There was an old fashion for the chamomile lawn and the chamomile seat, a low bank or bench of earth planted thick with chamomile, so that to sit upon it on a summer evening was to crush the small flowers and release their soft apple sweetness into the warm air. The medieval herbalist held that the chamomile, walked upon and crushed, grew only the stronger and the thicker, and took from this a small homely lesson: that there are some gentle things in this world that thrive the better for being trodden down, and do not break but spread. The flower was made into a warm tea for the easing of the stomach and the quieting of the mind at the close of the day, exactly as it is upon the kitchen shelf tonight. The very same small golden flower, the very same soft apple smell, the very same slow easing of the long day's cares. The 30th fact is this: the fennel, the tall feathery herb with its soft green threads of leaf, and its warm sweet seed that tastes of aniseed, was one of the most useful plants of the whole medieval cupboard, and it was given above all for the comfort of the stomach. The warm seeds were chewed after a heavy meal to settle the digestion and to sweeten the breath, and a warm water made from them was given to the fretful infant with the colic to ease the small clenching of the belly, exactly as the gentle gripe water of the chemist's shop is given to the fretful infant today. The fennel was held, too, to brighten and to strengthen the eyes, perhaps because the serpent, the old herbals say, was seen to rub its dimming eyes against the plant in the spring to clear its sight, and what was good for the serpent's eye might be good for the man's. It was a herb of warmth and of comfort and of clear sight, and it grew tall and golden and feathery at the back of every medieval garden, swaying a little in the summer wind above the lower herbs. The 31st fact is this: the mint, in all its many kinds, the spearmint and the watermint and the rest, was the great herb of the medieval stomach and the medieval table both. Its cool, sweet scent made it a favorite strewing herb, cast upon the floor of the hall and the church to be crushed underfoot, and its cooling virtue made it a favorite medicine, given for the easing of the stomach and the calming of the gut and the freshening of the mouth. The medieval herbalist knew, as we know, that the mint cools and settles, and gave it after a heavy meal, and steeped it in warm water for the aching belly, and the peppermint tea upon the modern kitchen shelf is the direct and unbroken descendant of those old warm cups. There was an old belief, too, that the mint must not be planted by a soldier going to war, for its cooling nature would cool his courage and slow his blood. And so the cool herb of the peaceful stomach was thought, by a strange logic, to be no friend to the hot work of the battlefield. The 32nd fact is this: the humble parsley, the curled green herb of every kitchen, had a darker and stranger reputation in the Middle Ages than its cheerful look would suggest. It was held to be very slow and very difficult to raise from seed, so slow that there grew up an old country saying that the parsley seed must go down to the devil and back 9 times before it would sprout, and that only a wicked person, or a household where the wife ruled the husband, could grow it well. To give a plant of parsley away, or to transplant it, was thought by some to bring ill luck or even death into the house. And yet, for all these dark country fancies, the parsley was also a sound and useful medicine, given for the cleansing of the body and the easing of the water, a herb of the kidneys and the blood, and eaten freely at the table for all its uncanny name. It is a small lesson in the medieval mind that the same green plant could be at once the cheerful garnish of the supper dish and the dark, slow seedling that must travel 9 times to the devil before it would deign to grow. The 33rd fact is this: the rue, the blue-green bitter herb with its small yellow flowers, was called the herb of grace, and it held a place in the medieval mind quite out of proportion to its modest look. It was thought to be a great guard against poison, and against plague, and against the evil eye, and against the bites of serpents and mad dogs and venomous things. The judges of the old courts carried sprigs of it, and it was strewn about the prisoner's dock, in the belief that it kept off the gall fever that the wretched prisoners carried, and so the very benches of the law were hedged about with the bitter blue-green herb. It was thought to sharpen the sight, and the old painters and engravers, it was said, ate of it to keep their eyes keen for their fine, close work. And yet the rue was a dangerous herb too, hot and strong, not to be taken in any great quantity, and most of all not by a woman with child, and so it sat, like so many of the old herbs, upon the narrow line between the medicine and the harm, a herb of grace and a herb of danger both, all in the one bitter blue-green leaf. The 34th fact is this: the beatony, a low purple flowered herb of the woodland edge and the dry meadow, was perhaps the single most trusted herb of the whole early medieval cupboard, and the old books heap such praise upon it that it grows almost comical. There was an old saying, "Sell your coat and buy betony," and the herbals claimed it good against some 44 different ills, from the aching head to the troubled stomach, to the bite of the mad dog, to the very terrors of the night. It was thought to guard the body and the soul alike, and was planted in the churchyards and worn as a charm against fearful dreams and against the wandering spirits of the dark. Whether it did the half of what was claimed for it is very doubtful, and the modern herbalist makes far more modest use of it. But there is something touching in the old trust placed in this one modest purple woodland flower, the way a frightened and uncertain age gathered up its hopes and its fears and laid them all upon one small, reliable plant, and slept a little easier for the sprig of betony hung above the door. The 35th fact is this, and with it we will leave the familiar plants and turn to the people who used them. The mugwort, a tall grey-green roadside weed that most of us pass 100 times without a glance, was one of the most honoured herbs of the whole old northern tradition. The very first and chief of the 9 sacred herbs of that old 9 herbs charm we spoke of before. It was called, in the Old English, the eldest of herbs, the mother of herbs, and it was hung above the door and worn in the shoe of the traveller, who believed that a sprig of mugwort in the boot would keep the legs from growing weary on the long road. It was burned at the great fires of midsummer and gathered with small ceremonies on the eve of the feast of St. John, and it carried, all through the Middle Ages, a faint old breath of the pre-Christian world, of the time before the monasteries, when the herbs were gathered with charms and the seasons turned by older fires. And it grows still, unregarded, along every roadside and every waste ground, this old mother of herbs, this eldest of the green wise things, dusty and grey and forgotten, watching the traffic go by. Let us turn now to the women healers and the wise women. The 36th fact is this. For the great mass of the medieval people, the poor of the villages and the countryside, the healer was not the learned physician of the town, whom they could never have afforded and rarely even saw, but the wise woman of their own village, the herb wife, the cunning woman, the gentle skilled neighbour who knew the plants of the hedge and the wood. She was the one who came when a child was sick in the night, and when a woman laboured to give birth, and when an old man could not be eased, and when a wound would not heal. She kept no books, for she very likely could not read, and she had no degree and no license, and no title save the quiet respect of her neighbours. Her whole learning was held in her memory, passed to her by word, and by hand from her own mother and grandmother, and she passed it on in the same way to her daughters. For the greater part of the people, for the greater part of the Middle Ages, this nameless and unrecorded woman was the whole of medicine, the one who stood between the sick poor and the dark. And she did her quiet work for so many centuries that we can scarcely now imagine the village without her. The 37th fact is this. The bringing of children into the world was, in the Middle Ages, almost entirely the work of women, and at its centre stood the midwife, the skilled woman who attended the birth. She was a figure of great importance and great trust in every community, for in those days the bearing of a child was the most dangerous thing most women would ever do, and a skilled and steady midwife might be the difference between life and death for both the mother and the child. She knew the herbs that were thought to ease the pains and hasten the slow birth, the raspberry leaf and the motherwort and others besides. She knew how to turn a child that lay wrong, and how to comfort and how to wait. And in the Christian world she carried, too, a solemn duty of the soul, for if a child seemed like to die before a priest could come, the midwife herself might baptize it, there in the birth chamber, with the water and the holy words, that its soul might not be lost. So the midwife held in her 2 hands the body and the soul of the newborn, both in the dark and the danger of the birth night, and she was honoured and feared a little for the great power that lay in her steady, experienced hands. The 38th fact is this. In the great houses of the medieval world, the care of the sick fell to the lady of the manor, and it was reckoned one of the chief and most honourable of her many duties. She was expected to keep a still room, a small room set apart for the distilling of waters and the making of medicines, and to keep her own book of receipts, copied in her own hand, of the syrups and the salves and the conserves and the cordial waters she made from the herbs of her own garden. When sickness came to the household, to the servants and the labourers, as well as to her own family, it was the lady who tended it, who made up the remedies and sat by the bedside and saw that all was done. These still room books, handed down from mother to daughter through the generations, each new mistress adding her own remedies and crossing out what had failed, are among the most human documents the age has left us. Full of the small daily care of one woman for the whole great household in her keeping, written in the gaps between the receipt for a cough syrup and the receipt for a quince preserve. The 39th fact is this: there was in the medieval world one place where a woman might study medicine in something close to a true school, and that was the great medical centre of Salerno, in the south of Italy, the oldest medical school in all of Europe. And out of Salerno comes the name of one of the very few medieval women healers, whose learning was written down and remembered, a woman we call Trota or Trotula. She lived, it is thought, in the 11th or 12th century, and her name became attached to a group of writings on the medicine of women, on the troubles of childbirth and the cares of the body, that were read all across Europe for hundreds of years. So great did her fame grow that in later, less generous ages, some could not believe a woman had written such things, and tried to give the work to a man. But the name endured, Trota of Salerno, the wise woman of the medical school, and she stands, almost alone and yet not quite alone, for all the countless skilled medical women of the Middle Ages, whose names were never written down at all. The 40th fact is this: the wise woman of the village walked, all her life, upon a narrow and a dangerous path, for the very knowledge that made her valued could also make her feared. She knew the herbs that healed, but to know the herbs that heal is also, very often, to know the herbs that harm, for the same plant that cures in a small dose may kill in a large one, and the woman who could ease a birth might be thought, by a frightened neighbour, to be able to prevent one or worse. She dealt in the unseen, in the secret virtues of plants, in charms and in old words, in the dark hours of the night when children were born and the sick were eased and the dead were laid out, and in the later Middle Ages and the centuries that followed, this nearness to the unseen turned, in the fearful imagination of the age, toward suspicion, and the wise woman, the cunning woman, the herb wife, found herself standing too near the dark line, where the healer was reimagined as the witch. It is one of the quiet sorrows of the history of medicine, that the long patient skill of the village women, which had healed the poor for 1,000 years, came in the end to be feared, and that some who had only ever meant to help came to grief for the knowledge in their gentle hands. The 41st fact is this: the knowledge of the wise women was not written, and so it has very largely vanished, and yet it has not vanished entirely, for it left its traces everywhere in the common speech and the common garden. The old country names of the plants are full of it, the names that tell what the plant was used for or who used it. Self, heal, and all, heal, and woundwort, and fever few, and lungwort, and the herb called Good King Henry, and 100 more, each carrying in its homely name the worn memory of the use the wise women put it to, long before any learned book wrote it down. The feverfew was the herb for fevers and for the aching head. The woundwort was laid upon the wound. The self healed of itself. These were the words of the kitchen and the cottage and the hedgerow, not the words of the Latin herbal, and through them, faint and worn as they are, the voice of the unlettered wise woman still reaches us, naming her plants by what they did in the plain old words of her own tongue. The 42nd fact is this, and it is a gentle one. Much of the medicine of the wise woman was, by the careful judgment of the modern world, of little true effect. The charm and the prayer and the herb whose virtue was only imagined. And yet she healed, and was loved, and was sent for again and again. And this is not so strange as it might seem, for she gave what the learned physician, with all his theory, could not always give. She came in the night to the poor cottage, and sat by the bed, and laid a warm hand upon a fevered head, and spoke softly, and made a warm drink, and stayed. The comfort of a calm and trusted presence, in the long fearful hours of a sickness, is itself a kind of medicine, and a real one, and the wise woman gave it freely. And the body, soothed and unafraid, very often did the rest of the healing on its own. We should not think her work all foolishness. A great part of all healing, in every age, including our own, is simply the easing of fear, and that she was, very often, a true and gifted master. The 43rd fact is this, and with it we will leave the wise women and turn to the apothecary's shop. The knowledge of the herbs passed, in the world of the wise women, almost entirely from woman to woman, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, in the long quiet apprenticeship of the cottage and the kitchen and the garden, year upon year. From the first small task of gathering the chamomile flowers to the last hard lessons of the birth chamber and the deathbed. There was no graduation, no certificate, no single day on which the girl became the wise woman. There was only the slow accumulation of the years, the watching and the doing and the remembering, until one day the daughter found that the neighbors were sending for her, and not for her mother, and knew, without any words being spoken, that the long chain had passed one link further down, and that she was now the one who would rise in the cold of the night and walk out into the dark with her basket of herbs to ease the suffering of her village, as her mother had, and her grandmother before her, back and back into the unrecorded dark. Let us turn now to the apothecary's shop and the guilds. The 44th fact is this. The apothecary, the keeper of the shop of medicines, began his long history not as a healer at all, but as a kind of grocer, a dealer in spices and dried goods. For in the medieval world the line between the spice and the medicine was very thin indeed. The same pepper that warmed the rich man's dish was given as a hot medicine for the cold humours. The same ginger and cinnamon and clove that flavoured the feast were weighed out as drugs against the chill of the stomach. And so the men who dealt in these costly dried things, these spices and these drugs that came from far away and kept long without spoiling, became in time a trade apart. The apothecaries, the keepers of the dried, and the powdered and the precious, the men whose small dark shops smelled of all the warm far countries of the earth at once. The 45th fact is this. The shop of the apothecary was a thing of wonder to the medieval eye, and it was meant to be. Along the walls ran the long shelves, and upon them stood the rows of jars. The albarelli, as the most beautiful of them were called, tall-waisted jars of bright painted majolica ware, glazed in blue and gold and green, each holding its own drug or spice or conserve, and labelled in careful letters with the name of what it held. There were jars of clear green glass for the distilled waters, and small drawers of dark wood for the seeds and the roots, and great brass mortars upon the counter for the pounding of the herbs, and hanging scales for the careful weighing, and bunches of dried plants hanging from the beams, and the whole small room thick with the mingled scent of 100 dried and powdered things. To step into it was to step into a kind of treasure house of the green and the powdered earth, ordered and labelled and gleaming, and the apothecary moved among his jars like a priest among the vessels of his altar. The 46th fact is this: the apothecaries, like all the skilled trades of the medieval town, banded together into guilds, the sworn brotherhoods of a craft, that watched over the standards and the prices and the training of the trade. In the city of London, the apothecaries were for a long time bound up with the Guild of the Grocers, that ancient company whose very name comes from those who dealt in the gross, the great bulk weights of the spice trade. Only later, well after the close of the Middle Ages proper, did the apothecaries break away to form a guild and a society of their own. The guild kept a jealous watch upon the trade. It set the rules of the long apprenticeship, the 7 years and more that a boy must serve before he might call himself a master. It inspected the shops and seized and burned the drugs that had spoiled or been falsely made. And it guarded the secrets and the standing of the craft, so that the name of apothecary should mean a man who could be trusted with the powerful and costly, and sometimes dangerous things he kept upon his shelves. The 47th fact is this: the apprenticeship of the apothecary was a long and a hard road. A boy might be bound to a master at 12 or 14 years of age, and would serve for 7 years or more, living in the master's house, sweeping the shop and tending the fire and pounding the herbs in the great mortar until his arms ached, and slowly, year by year, learning the craft. He must learn the hundreds of drugs, and their names and their virtues and their dangers. He must learn to read the physician's prescriptions, often written in a crabbed Latin shorthand. He must learn to weigh to a hair's breadth, for a small error in the weighing of a strong drug might be the difference between the cure and the grave. He must learn to distill and to compound and to preserve. And at the end of his long years, he must satisfy the masters of his guild that he knew his craft before he might open a shop of his own. It was a long, slow making of a man, that apprenticeship, and the boy who swept the floor at 12 came out of it. At 21, a master of one of the most exacting trades of the medieval town. The 48th fact is this: there was one medicine above all others that was the pride and the test of the apothecary's whole craft, and it was called theriac, or, in the older English, treacle. It was the great cure, all of the ancient and medieval world, a medicine said to be good against poisons and plagues, and almost every ill that flesh could suffer. And it was made to a recipe of astonishing complexity, with 60 and 70, and sometimes more ingredients, herbs and spices and gums and minerals, and at the very heart of it, the flesh of the viper, the venomous snake, on the old principle that the cure for poison must contain a little of the poison itself. The making of it was a great public event in some cities, carried out in the open square under the eye of the guild and the physicians, that all might see it honestly made, for so costly and so famous a medicine was much counterfeited. The finest theriac came from the city of Venice, the Venice treacle, and was traded across all of Europe at a great price, and the word treacle, which once meant this great and complex medicine against all poisons, has dwindled down the long centuries into nothing more than the sweet dark syrup on the modern breakfast table. The 49th fact is this: the apothecary kept his own physic garden behind or beside his shop for the freshest and the commonest of his herbs, and gathered the rest from the country folk who brought them in to sell, the herb gatherers and the root diggers who knew where the wild plants grew. But the costliest and the strangest of his wares came from very far away indeed, carried along the long trade roads from the ends of the known world. The pepper and the ginger and the nutmeg came from the distant Indies, the cinnamon from the island of Ceylon, the cloves from a few small islands so far to the east that no European of the Middle Ages had ever seen them. The frankincense and the myrrh came from Arabia, the rhubarb root from the far interior of Asia, the sugar, then a costly medicine and not yet a cheap food, from the warm lands of the south. The small dark shop of the town apothecary was, in this way, the near end of a web of trade that stretched halfway round the world, and the scent of it, that mingled scent of all those dried far things, was quite literally the smell of the whole wide earth, gathered into one small room. The 50th fact is this, and it brings us to the very midpoint of our 100. We have walked now through 5 chapters and 50 facts, through the monastery garden and the 4 humours, through the old books and the familiar plants and the wise women, and into the apothecary's shop. We are halfway. If your eyes have already closed, then all is well, and the second 50 will keep until another night, or will drift softly past you in your sleep. And if you are still here, still listening in the warm dark, then let us pause a moment here at the middle and take a slow breath before we go on. For the second half of our walk turns slowly toward the stranger and the gentler things, toward the careful gathering of the herbs and the curious doctrine of signatures, toward the dark remedies against the plague, toward the herbs for sleep and for pain, toward the dangerous plants used with the most careful hand, and at the last toward the quiet survival of all this old lore into the medicine of our own day. The apothecary in our small candlelit shop has set a fresh log upon the fire. The child sleeps now against her mother's shoulder, her fever a little eased by the warm drink. The carter dozes by the hearth. Let us go on slowly into the second half of the night. Let us linger a moment longer in the apothecary's shop itself before we go on into the second 50, for it is a place worth dwelling in, and the dwelling there is restful. Imagine, then, that you have stepped in out of the medieval street, out of the noise and the mud and the press of the market day, and the heavy door has swung shut behind you, and you stand in the cool dim hush of the shop. The first thing that comes to you is the smell, and it is like no other smell in all the medieval town, for it is the mingled breath of 100 dried and powdered things at once, the sweetness of the dried roses, and the warm spice of the cinnamon and the clove, the sharp, clean bite of the dried mint, and the wormwood, the dark earthy note of the roots, the faint waxy scent of the salves and the ointments, all blended together into one rich and complex and faintly drowsy air that hangs in the dim room like a slow incense. And then your eyes grow used to the dimness, and you begin to see the long shelves running up the walls, and the rows upon rows of jars upon them, the tall, wasted painted jars of blue and gold and green, each with its name lettered upon its belly in a careful hand, a name half in Latin and half in some old shorthand of the trade. The small dark drawers below, 100 of them, each with its tiny brass ring and its tiny written label, holding the seeds and the dried roots and the small precious things. The great brass mortar upon the counter, worn bright and smooth by a lifetime of pounding, and the heavy pestle leaning in it. The hanging scales of polished brass, with their small bright pans, swaying very slightly in the draught from the door. The bunches of dried herbs hanging from the dark beams overhead, turning slowly, casting their slow shadows in the candlelight. And behind the counter the apothecary himself, in his long dark gown, his sleeves pushed back, his careful eyes upon the small bright pan of the balance as he weighs out, grain by grain, the powder for a waiting customer. There is a deep and a quiet order to it all, and that order is itself a kind of beauty. Nothing is where it should not be. Every jar has its place upon the shelf, and the apothecary could lay his hand upon any one of the hundreds of them in the dark. So well does he know his own shop. So many thousands of times has he reached for this jar or that. The dangerous drugs, the poisons, are kept apart and high and locked, where no careless hand can reach them. The common simples are kept low and near, where they can be reached 100 times a day. The costly spices are kept in the small locked cabinet behind the counter, where the apothecary can keep his eye upon them. It is a whole small ordered world, built up over a lifetime. A place where every single thing has its name, and its place and its purpose. And there is a deep restfulness in such a place, in the very orderliness of it, that is felt by everyone who steps into it, then and now. And there is time in the apothecary's shop, time of a kind that has grown rare in our own hurried age. The making of the medicines could not be hurried. The pounding of a hard root to a fine powder in the great brass mortar might take an hour of patient, steady work. The slow distilling of a fragrant water might take a whole long morning of watching the fire and catching the slow, bright drops. The steeping of a herb, the boiling down of a syrup, the working of a salve, all of it was slow, all of it was done by hand, all of it asked patience above all things. The apothecary's whole life was a life of patient, slow, careful work with his hands, in the quiet of his dim and fragrant shop, weighing and pounding and mixing and watching, day after day, year after year. And there is something in the very thought of it that slows the breath and quiets the mind. The long, unhurried, patient days of a craft that could not be rushed, in a small, warm room that smelled of all the spices of the earth. Hold that quieter moment, the dim shop and the slow work and the rich, drowsy air, and then let us go gently on into the second half of our 100. The 51st fact is this. There was in the medieval town a careful and sometimes a jealous boundary drawn between the physician and the apothecary, and it is worth a quiet word, for it shaped the whole world of the medieval sick room. The physician was the learned man, schooled at the university in the theory of the Humours, and the writings of the ancients, who reasoned about the cause of the sickness and decided what should be done. But he very rarely touched a drug or a herb with his own hands. He wrote the prescription in his careful Latin, and it was the apothecary who made it up, who weighed and pounded and mixed and compounded the actual medicine from the things upon his shelves. The physician was the head and the apothecary the hands, in theory at least, and the physicians guarded the distinction proudly and looked down a little upon the apothecary as a mere tradesman. But the truth of the street was kinder and more tangled, for the poor could not afford the physician's fee, and went straight to the apothecary and asked his advice and took what he gave. And so the apothecary, in plain fact, was very often the only healer the common townsfolk ever saw, the physician of the poor in all but name. The 52nd fact is this, and with it we will leave the shop. The apothecary swore an oath when he was made a master of his guild, and the oath bound him to honesty and to care, and it is a thing worth remembering. He swore to make his medicines truly and faithfully, of good and unspoiled ingredients, and not to substitute a cheaper drug for a costly one, nor a weaker for a stronger. He swore to keep the dangerous drugs, the poisons locked carefully away, and not to sell them to any who might do harm. He swore to keep the secrets of the sick who came to him, and to deal justly with rich and poor alike. It was a grave and a humane oath, and most apothecaries, we may believe, kept it as well as men keep any oath, which is to say imperfectly, but on the whole faithfully, for their whole standing and their living depended upon the trust of the town. And an apothecary known to cheat or to poison would not keep his shop above his head for long. Behind the rows of bright jars and the great brass mortar stood, in the end, a man who had sworn to be trusted with the health and the secrets of his neighbors, and who lived, for the most part, as if he meant it. Let us turn now to the gathering and the drying and the keeping of the herbs. The 53rd fact is this: the gathering of the herbs was never a careless thing in the Middle Ages, for it was believed that the virtue of a plant rose and fell with the season and the hour and even the turning of the moon, and that a herb gathered at the wrong time was a herb half wasted. Each plant had its proper season for the picking. The leaves were gathered when the plant was in full vigor, before it came to flower, when its strength was thought to be all in the leaf. The flowers were gathered just as they opened, in the dry of the day. The seeds were gathered when they were ripe, but before they fell. And the roots, where the root was the part used, were dug in the autumn or the very early spring, when the strength of the plant had drawn down out of the dying leaves and gathered itself into the root below the ground, against the coming or the passing of the winter. To gather well was half the art, and the wise woman and the apothecary alike kept in their heads a whole quiet calendar of the year, knowing to a week or two when each herb stood at its best, and gathering it then, and at no other time. The 54th fact is this: the hour of the day, and even the weather, were thought to matter greatly in the gathering. The herbs were gathered, by long custom, in the morning, after the dew had dried, but before the heat of the noon, for the dew was thought to weaken or to spoil the plant, and the strong noon sun to scorch its virtue. They were gathered in dry weather, never in the wet, for a plant gathered damp would mold and spoil in the drying and never keep. And there were finer rules still, kept by the most careful, that this herb should be gathered under the waxing moon, when its strength was growing, and that herb under the waning, and that certain herbs of great power should be gathered only on certain holy days, or at the turning of the seasons, with a small prayer or a small charm spoken over them as they were cut. Much of this was the old magic clinging to the practical craft, and yet the practical core of it was sound. For a herb gathered in the dry cool of the morning truly does dry and keep far better than one gathered wet in the heat of the day. And the old rule, whatever the reason given for it, led the gatherer's hand aright. The 55th fact is this: once gathered, the herbs must be dried, and the drying was an art of its own, for a herb badly dried was a herb lost. The most common way was to gather the cut herbs into small loose bunches, bound at the stem, and to hang them head downward from the beams of an airy loft or a dry shed, out of the direct sun, where the warm dry air might move slowly among them and draw the moisture out over many days. The bunches were hung loose and not crowded, so that the air could reach every leaf, for a herb packed too tight would heat and mold in its own damp. The roots were washed and sliced and laid out upon trays or screens of woven wattle, and the seeds were spread thin upon cloths, and the flowers were dried most carefully of all, in the shade, that they might keep their color and their scent. To walk into a medieval drying loft in the autumn was to walk beneath a whole hanging forest of the summer's herbs, the bunches turning slowly in the draught, the air thick and sweet with their mingled drying scent, the whole green harvest of the year suspended overhead in the brown and golden dusk. The 56th fact is this: the apothecary and the herb wife spoke of two great kinds of medicine, and the words they used have a quiet beauty. A medicine made of a single herb, used alone, was called a simple. A medicine made of many herbs and other things mixed together, compounded into one, was called a compound. The simples were the foundation of the whole craft. The single known herbs, each with its single known virtue: the sage for the throat, the chamomile for the stomach, the betony for the head. The compounds were the higher art, the careful mixing of many simples into one great medicine, each herb chosen to add its virtue or to temper the harshness of another, like the voices of a choir blended into one chord. The great Theriac, with its 60 and more ingredients, was the mightiest of all the compounds. But the daily work of healing rested far more upon the humble simples, the single herbs gathered and dried and given alone. And to this day we keep the old word, and call a plain herbal remedy a simple still, a word worn smooth by 600 years of use. The 57th fact is this: to keep the virtue of the herbs through the long year, and to make them pleasant to take, the apothecary turned them into many forms, and the names of these are like a small poem of the old craft. There was the conserve, the herb or the flower pounded together with sugar or honey into a soft, sweet paste, that kept for months and was eaten by the spoonful, the conserve of roses being the most famous and the most beloved. There was the electuary, a yet richer paste of powdered herbs worked up with honey, a medicine you could almost call a sweetmeat. There was the syrup, the virtue of the herb drawn out into a thick, sweet liquid that slipped easily down a sore throat. There was the decoction, the herb boiled in water to draw out its strength, and the infusion, the gentler steeping of the herb in water merely hot, as we steep a tea. There were oils and salves and ointments for the outward hurts, the herbs steeped in oil or worked into wax and fat for the rubbing upon the skin. The whole craft was, in part, a craft of preserving, of catching the fleeting virtue of the summer herb and keeping it, sweet and ready, against the need of the dark of the year. The 58th fact is this. The making of distilled waters was, by the later Middle Ages, one of the proudest arts of the apothecary, and the great lady still, rumour like, and it was done with a strange and beautiful piece of apparatus called the alembic. The fresh herb was set with water in the great rounded belly of the still, and a slow fire was lit beneath, and as the water boiled, the steam rose, carrying with it the fragrant volatile virtue of the herb into the cool domed cap of the still above, where it struck the cold metal and turned back into drops, and ran down a long curving spout into a waiting flask, drop by slow drop, as the fragrant distilled water, rose water and lavender water, and the waters of 100 herbs were made in this way, and prized both as medicines and as sweet scents, and the slow patient work of the still, the watching of the fire, and the catching of the slow bright drops, was one of the gentle arts of the medieval household, half medicine and half magic, and the very word we use for strong drink, spirits, comes from this old belief that what the still drew up and out of the herb was its very spirit, its inmost soul, caught and held in a cool, clear drop. The 59th fact is this. The careful keeping of the seeds was, in its quiet way, the keeping of the future, for a herb garden lives only so long as its seeds are saved and sown again. The medieval gardener gathered the ripe seed of his herbs in the late summer and the autumn, dried it well, and kept it dry and cool and safe from the mice through the long winter, in small clay pots or twists of paper or little linen bags, each carefully marked, that he might sow it again in the spring. Some seeds keep their life for only a year or two, and must be gathered fresh each season. Others sleep on, dry and patient, for many years, and will wake and grow when at last they are sown. The gardener learned which was which by long experience, and kept his seed accordingly, and so the herb gardens of medieval Europe came down, year by year and seed by seed, in an unbroken green chain from one generation to the next. The very plants in the monastery bed, being the lineal descendants, through 1,000 savings of seed, of the plants the first monks had sown there centuries before. The 60th fact is this, and with it we will leave the gathering and turn to one of the strangest ideas of the whole tradition. For all their care, the medieval gatherers laboured under one great misfortune, which was that they had no way to truly preserve a herb against the slow loss of its virtue over time. However well dried and however carefully kept, the herbs grew slowly weaker as the months passed, their volatile oils fading, their colour and their scent and their strength all slowly leaching away, until the dried leaf of 2 years past was little more than a memory of the herb it once had been. The careful apothecary knew this, and dated his jars, and renewed his stock each year from the new harvest, and threw out or burned the old, for a stale herb in the jar was a broken promise to the sick. And so the whole cycle turned again, the gathering and the drying, and the keeping and the using and the casting out of the old, year upon year, in time with the turning of the seasons, the garden filling the jars in the autumn, and the jars slowly emptying through the year, until the autumn came round once more, and the bunches were hung again from the dark beams of the loft. Let us turn now to the doctrine of signatures. The 61st fact is this: there ran through the whole of medieval and later herbal medicine a strange and a beautiful and a mostly mistaken idea, which we call the doctrine of signatures, and it held that the Creator had marked each healing plant with a sign, a signature, that revealed the use for which it was made. The shape of a plant, or its color, or the part of the body it resembled, was thought to be a clue, set there on purpose for the eye of the wise, pointing to the ailment or the part it would cure. A plant with leaves shaped like a heart was for the heart. A plant whose juice ran red was for the blood. A plant whose flower was shaped like an open eye was for the eyes. It was a comforting and a hopeful idea that the world was a kind of great book written by a kindly hand, in which the cure for every ill was set out plainly in plain sight, if only one had the wit to read the signs. It was, for the most part, quite wrong, but it was wrong in such a gentle and a hopeful way, and it shaped so many of the old uses of the plants that it deserves a quiet chapter of its own. The 62nd fact is this: the plant called lungwort is a fair example of the doctrine of signatures, and it shows both the charm and the error of the whole idea. Lungwort is a low woodland plant whose broad green leaves are spotted and mottled with pale grey-white spots, and to the medieval eye these spotted leaves looked very like the spotted, mottled appearance of a diseased human lung. And so, by the doctrine of signatures, lungwort was held to be the Creator's appointed medicine for the diseases of the lungs, for the cough and the consumption and the labouring breath, and it was given freely for all of these. Its very name, in English and in Latin both, comes from this supposed virtue, the wort or herb of the lung. Now the plain truth is that lungwort has only a mild and gentle action, soothing perhaps to a sore throat, but no true and certain cure for any disease of the lung at all. The spotted leaf had promised more than the plant could give, and yet the name endures, lungwort, a small green monument to a hopeful guess, growing still in the shaded woods, its spotted leaves still whispering their old false promise to anyone who knows the story. It is worth pausing a moment, here among the signatures, to feel how the whole idea must have looked to the medieval eye, for it is easy to laugh at it from a great distance, and harder and kinder to understand it from within. Imagine a world without any of the instruments of our own, without the glass that magnifies and the chemistry that analyses, a world in which the only tools a healer had to understand a plant were his own 5 senses and his own patient mind. He could look at the plant and smell it and taste it and feel the texture of its leaf and watch where it chose to grow, and that was all. And looking so closely, so patiently, at the shapes and the colors and the markings of the plants, hour upon hour, year upon year, it is no wonder that the medieval herbalist began to see meaning in them, began to feel that surely all this intricate detail, this freckling and vining and lobing and curling, could not be there for nothing, must be there to be read, must be a message of some kind from the hand that made it. The doctrine of signatures was, at bottom, the natural error of a mind looking very hard and very long at the world, and finding it so full of pattern that it could not believe the pattern was empty of meaning. And the trouble was that it worked just often enough to keep the faith alive. Now and then a plant that looked like the part, it was supposed to heal truly did heal it, by pure coincidence, as the walnut did seem to feed the brain, and the hawthorn did seem to steady the heart, and each such lucky hit was remembered and told and retold, while the countless failures were quietly forgotten. This is one of the oldest traps of the human mind, in every age including our own, that we remember the times a belief came true, and forget the far more numerous times it did not, and so a belief that is mostly false can seem, to the one who holds it, to be confirmed again and again. The medieval herbalist fell into that trap, as we all do, and built upon a handful of lucky coincidences a whole sweeping theory of the world. We should not feel too far above him. We do the very same thing still, in 100 quiet ways, and it takes the slow, hard discipline of true science, the careful counting of the failures as well as the successes, to climb at last out of that ancient and very human trap. The 63rd fact is this: the walnut, by the doctrine of signatures, was held to be a medicine for the head and the brain, and the reasoning, once you hear it, is hard to forget. Crack open a walnut, the old herbalists said, and look upon the nut within. The hard outer shell is like the skull. The thin papery skin within is like the membranes that wrap the brain. And the wrinkled, folded, two-lobed nut itself, sitting in its shell, is the very image of the wrinkled, folded, two-lobed brain sitting within the skull. Surely, they reasoned, the Creator had drawn this likeness on purpose, to show that the walnut was the appointed food and medicine of the brain, good for the head, good for the wits, good against the headache and the failing memory. It is a wonderful piece of looking, and it is, in the strict sense, quite without foundation, for the walnut is no certain cure for any disease of the head. And yet, by one of the small jokes that history loves, the modern science of nutrition has found the walnut to be genuinely good for the brain after all, rich in the very oils the brain most needs, so that the old herbalists, reasoning from a likeness for all the wrong reasons, stumbled by pure chance upon a small truth. The 64th fact is this: the little plant called eyebright, a low meadow flower with small white blooms touched at their center with a spot of yellow and a streak of purple, was held by the doctrine of signatures to be the very medicine of the eyes. For in its small flower the medieval eye saw the likeness of a tiny bright human eye with its dark and colored center. And so eyebright was given for every trouble of the sight. For the sore eye and the dim eye and the weeping eye, distilled into a water and dropped upon the lid, or drunk as a tea to clear the inward sight. Its very name in every European tongue carries the meaning. Eyebright, the brightener of the eyes. The plain modern judgment is that it has little real power over the diseases of the eye, beyond a mild soothing of a minor irritation. But the name has lasted, and the old use lingers on in the folk medicine of the present day. And there is something so gentle in the picture, the meadow scattered with these small bright eyes, all of them looking up at the summer sky. That one is almost sorry to learn the cure was never quite real. The 65th fact is this: the plant called liverwort, a low-spreading plant of the damp, shaded places, was held to heal the liver, for the simple reason that its flat, lobed body was thought to resemble the shape of the liver itself, that great lobed dark organ within the body. By the doctrine of signatures, the likeness was a sign, and liverwort was given for the diseases of the liver, and the jaundice, and the disorders of the blood that the liver was thought to govern. It is a clear and simple example of the whole way of thinking. The eye finding a likeness between the plant and the part, and the mind concluding from the likeness a cure. And it shows, too, how the doctrine fed upon itself, for once a plant was named for a part of the body, its very name kept the supposed cure alive, generation after generation, long after anyone remembered the spotted leaf or the lobe body that had first suggested it. The names of our plants are full of these old medical guesses, liverwort and lungwort and spleenwort and the rest, a whole quiet anatomy of hopeful resemblances, growing green and unregarded in the damp corners of the wood. The 66th fact is this: the pretty little flower we call heartsease, the small wild pansy of the meadow and the garden edge, with its face of purple and yellow and white, was held a medicine for the heart, both the heart of the body and the heart of the feelings, and its very name, heartsease, means the easing of the heart. By the doctrine of signatures, some said its rounded notched petals carried a likeness to the human heart, and so it was given for the palpitations and the troubles of that organ. But more than that, it was given for the sorrows of love and the heaviness of the grieving spirit, for an aching heart of quite another kind, and it kept a whole crowd of tender old names that show how dearly the country people loved it. Love in idleness, and kiss me at the garden gate, and three faces under a hood. It is one of those plants whose medicine was always more of the spirit than the body, given less to cure a true disease than to comfort a sorrow, and perhaps in its own small way it did, for to be handed a flower called heartsease by a kindly neighbour in a time of grief may ease the heart a little after all, whatever the modern apothecary may say of its chemistry. The 67th fact is this: there was a small blue flowered plant that the old herbalists called scorpion grass, because its flowering stem curled over at the tip in a tight coil, like the curled tail of a scorpion poised to strike. And by the doctrine of signatures, this likeness to the scorpion was read as a sign that the plant was the appointed cure for the scorpion sting, and it was given and applied for the bites and stings of venomous things, on the old principle that the shape revealed the cure. We know this little plant by a gentler name today, for it is the flower we now call the forget-me-not, the small sky blue flower of the streamside and the damp meadow, and its old coiled scorpion shape that once promised a cure for venom, we now read only as the pretty nodding curl of one of the best loved of all wild flowers. The same plant, the same coiled stem, read once as a warning of the scorpion, and now as a token of remembrance and of love. The flower did not change. Only the eyes that looked upon it changed, and the story they chose to tell. The 68th fact is this, and with it we will leave the doctrine of signatures. The whole great idea, charming and mistaken as it was not pure foolishness, and it would be wrong to leave it with a laugh and no more. For it was, at bottom, an early and a clumsy attempt to do the very thing that all medicine tries to do, to find a pattern, to read the book of nature, to believe that the world is ordered and intelligible, and that its order can be learned. The medieval mind, looking at the spotted leaf and the lobed root and the eye-shaped flower, was reaching, however it stumbled, toward the great hope that lies beneath all science, the hope that things are connected, that the cure is somewhere written in the world, that a patient and a reverent looking will in the end be rewarded with understanding. They read the signs wrongly, far more often than rightly, but they believed the signs were there to be read, and in that belief, mistaken as their reading was, they were the distant ancestors of every scientist who has ever bent over the world in the faith that it would, at last, make sense. There is one more thing worth saying before we move on, and it is that the next chapter turns to a darker matter, the Great Plague, and to the herbs that the frightened people of the Middle Ages set. In their desperation against the worst thing that ever came among them, let us turn now to the plague remedies and the great sickness. The 69th fact is this. In the middle of the 14th century, there came upon Europe the most terrible sickness in all its history, the great pestilence that later ages would call the Black Death, and it killed, in the space of a very few years, perhaps a third and perhaps a half of all the people of the continent. Against this horror the medieval physicians and apothecaries stood very nearly helpless, for they did not know what caused it, and nothing they had could truly cure it. And yet they did not stand idle, for that is not in the nature of those who tend the sick, and they reached for the only things they had, the herbs and the spices and the old remedies, and set them, with all the faith and all the desperation of the age, against the advancing dark. Most of what they did could not touch the true cause of the plague at all. But in the doing of it we can see, very clearly, the courage and the tenderness of the medieval healer, going out among the dying with a posy of herbs pressed to the face, doing the only things he knew, in the teeth of a thing far greater than himself. The 70th fact is this. The medieval physicians believed that the plague was carried upon the air, in a foul and corrupted vapor they called the miasma, a bad air rising from rotting things and standing water and the breath of the sick, and that to breathe this corrupted air was to take the disease, and so a great part of all the plague medicine was aimed at the air, at cleansing and sweetening and guarding the very breath. They burned great fires of fragrant wood in the streets and the houses to drive off the corruption with the clean smoke. They burned juniper and rosemary and bay and other sweet herbs upon the hearth, filling the rooms with their pungent smoke. They carried sweet-smelling things to hold to the face, that the good scent might keep off the bad air. The whole theory was mistaken, for the plague was carried not by foul air, but by the bite of fleas borne upon the rats, a thing no one would understand for 500 years and more. And yet, by the strangest of chances, the burning and the cleansing, and the avoiding of the filthy places did sometimes help a little, for cleaner places held fewer rats and fewer fleas, and so the right thing was sometimes done, for entirely the wrong reason, in the long blind groping of the age against the dark. The 71st fact is this. From this fear of the corrupted air came one of the most enduring images of the whole Middle Ages and the centuries that followed, the plague doctor in his long waxed gown and his strange beaked mask. The mask was made with a great curved beak, like the beak of some grim bird, and within that beak was packed a quantity of dried herbs and flowers and spices, the rose and the carnation, the mint and the camphor, the clove and the laudanum, and the dried orange peel, a whole small garden of sweet and pungent things. The doctor breathed through this packed beak, so that every breath he drew came filtered through the herbs, and he believed that their strong sweet scent would guard him from the corrupted air of the sick room. The beaked mask belongs, in truth, more to the later Great Plagues than to the medieval Black Death itself. But the idea behind it was wholly medieval. The faith that the sweet herb could stand between a man and the breath of death, and that a beakful of dried roses might be a shield against the end of the world. The 72nd fact is this. The pomander was the more elegant cousin of the plague doctor's beak, and it was carried by the rich and the careful all through the plague years and long after. It was a small hollow ball, often of gold or silver, beautifully worked and pierced with small holes, that hung upon a chain at the waist or the neck, and within it was packed a paste of the most precious aromatic things, the costly ambergris and musk, the rose and the clove, the cinnamon and the gum, all worked together into a sweet and lasting scent. The very name pomander comes from the Old French for an apple of amber, for the first ones were made about a lump of ambergris the size of an apple. The wearer held the pomander to the face when passing through a foul street or a crowded place or near the sick, and breathed its rich scent and felt the safer for it. It was at once a jewel and a medicine and a charm against death, this small golden ball of sweetness, and it is the direct ancestor, by a long and gentle descent, of the bottle of perfume upon the modern dressing table. The 73rd fact is this. There is an old children's rhyme, sung to this day in the playgrounds of the English-speaking world, that many believe to be a small dark memory of the plague, and whether the belief is true or not, it is a haunting thing to hear it so. It speaks of a ring of roses, and a pocket full of posies, and of all falling down. And the common telling holds that the ring of roses was the round red mark upon the skin that the plague was thought to bring, and the pocket full of posies was the very handful of sweet herbs that the people carried against the corrupted air, exactly the herbs we have been speaking of, and the falling down was the falling down into death. Now the careful historians doubt this story, and point out that the rhyme cannot be traced back nearly so far as the plague years, and that its older forms are different. So it may be only a pretty tale we tell about a children's song, but the posies in the pocket are real enough, whatever the rhyme may mean. For the people truly did carry handfuls of sweet herbs against the plague, and a child skipping in a modern playground may be singing, all unknowing, a faint and broken echo of that old terror, or may not be, and we cannot quite tell, and that uncertainty too is part of the long, strange story. The 74th fact is this. There was a famous plague remedy of the later Great Plagues that went by the name of the Four Thieves' Vinegar, and a wonderful legend grew up about its making. The story told of four thieves who, during a great plague, robbed the houses and even the very bodies of the dead, without ever themselves falling sick, and who, when at last they were caught, were offered their lives in exchange for the secret of how they had stayed well among so much death. And the secret, they said, was a vinegar in which they had steeped a great quantity of herbs, the rosemary and the sage, the wormwood and the rue, the lavender and the mint and the garlic, with which they washed themselves and which they breathed through cloths held to the face. The Four Thieves' Vinegar became a famous remedy, sold and made for generations. And whatever the truth of the four thieves themselves, the herbs in it were the same brave aromatic herbs we have met all through this chapter. The people's whole green armory against the breath of the plague, gathered into one sharp and pungent vinegar, and worn like armor against the dark. The 75th fact is this: the great cure-all theriac, that mighty compound of 60 and more ingredients that we met in the apothecary's shop, was reached for above almost all else in the time of the plague, for it was held to be the sovereign remedy against all poisons, and the plague was thought to be a kind of poison in the body. The rich and the powerful paid great sums for the finest Venice treacle in the plague years, and swallowed it down in hope, and the apothecaries could scarcely make it fast enough. It could not, of course, touch the true plague at all, for nothing then known could. And yet it is worth pausing on the picture of it, the frightened people of a dying city, pouring out their gold for a spoonful of dark bitter paste, made of vipers and herbs, and honey to an ancient secret recipe, swallowing it down in the desperate hope that this one old famous medicine, trusted for 1,000 years, might be the thing that saved them. It did not save them, but the hope itself in such a time was perhaps not nothing, and we should be slow to mock the drowning for clutching at the only rope they had ever been told would hold. The 76th fact is this, and with it we will leave the dark chapter of the plague and turn toward gentler things. For all that the medieval remedies could not cure the plague, the great sickness changed the whole world of medicine in a way that no remedy could, for it shook the old faith in the ancient authorities to its roots. The physicians had trusted the books of the ancients, the Galen and the Dioscorides, for 1,000 years, and when the plague came and the ancient books offered no cure, and the learned physicians died as fast as the poor, a great crack opened, very slowly, in the old confidence. If the ancients had not foreseen this, what else had they not known? It would take centuries for that crack to widen into the new science of later ages, and the herbs and the humours would rule for a long time yet. But the plague had planted a seed of doubt, a small cold seed, that the world is stranger and larger than the old books had said, and that perhaps the truth must be sought anew with one's own eyes in the world itself. And so even out of that great darkness there came, in time, a small and unexpected light. Let us turn now to the gentlest chapter of all, the herbs for sleep and for the easing of pain, and let us slow our pace, for these are the herbs of the quiet evening, and the hour grows late. The 77th fact is this: the root of the valerian, a tall pink and white-flowered plant of the damp meadow and the stream-side, was the great calming and sleep-bringing herb of the medieval cupboard, given for the troubled mind, the racing thoughts, the body that would not grow quiet and let go into sleep. The root has a strange heavy earthy smell, not at all sweet, that cats love beyond all reason and roll upon in delight, and that gives the herb one of its old country names, for it was sometimes called by names that recall the cat. The medieval herbalist gave the dried root, steeped into a warm drink at the close of the day, to those who lay awake with worry, to soothe the nerves and to draw down the heavy curtain of sleep. And here the old herb and the modern judgment are very nearly agreed, for the valerian is still used today in the very same way, for the very same purpose, sold upon the shelf of the modern chemist as a gentle aid to sleep, one of the small handful of medieval herbs whose old reputation the modern world has examined and, on the whole, allowed to stand. The 78th fact is this: the flower of the hop, that same green papery cone that gives the beer its bitter savour, was held a herb of sleep, and was used in one of the gentlest of all the old remedies for a wakeful night, the hop pillow. A small pillow or sachet was stuffed with the dried hop flowers and laid beneath or beside the head of the sleeper, and the faint, heavy soporific scent that rose from the warmed flowers through the night was thought to coax the wakeful into sleep. It was a famous remedy for the restless, and it was even, in much later ages, made up for a mad and sleepless king, that he might find some rest. There is no harsh drug in it, no danger, nothing but the soft scent of the dried flowers warming slowly beneath the head through the dark hours. And yet many swore by it, and many swear by it still. Perhaps it is the faint, true sedative breath of the hop. Perhaps it is only the gentle ritual of it, the making and the laying of the small, fragrant pillow, the telling of the body that now it is time, at last, to sleep. Either way, it is a kindly thing, and harmless and old, and it is working its quiet work in some bedroom even tonight. The 79th fact is this. The common lettuce, the cool green leaf of the summer salad, was reckoned by the medieval herbalist, following the ancients, to be a herb of sleep, cold and moist in its nature, cooling to the hot blood and quieting to the wakeful mind. The wild lettuce, the rougher cousin of the garden kind, when its stem is broken, yields a thick white milky juice, bitter and faintly narcotic, and this milky juice was gathered and dried into a substance that was given for sleep and for the easing of pain, a mild and gentle thing, far weaker than the great poppy, but real. The ancients had told a pretty tale that the goddess of love had laid the dead body of her beloved upon a bed of lettuce, and so the cool leaf was bound up with grief and with the long sleep. And the medieval herbalist, gathering up the tale with the herb, gave the lettuce for the cooling of the overheated and the quieting of the sleepless, and a cool lettuce supper on a hot summer night was thought to bring on a cooler and an easier sleep, as perhaps, in its mild way, it truly does. The 80th fact is this. The poppy, the scarlet flower of the cornfield with its black heart, and above all its eastern cousin, were the source of the single most powerful medicine the medieval world possessed for the easing of pain and the bringing of sleep. For from the unripe seed head of the poppy is drawn the milky juice that dries into opium. The medieval apothecary knew the poppy well, and knew its power, and knew its danger too, for the same draught that could lull a screaming agony into a merciful sleep could, in too great a measure, lull the sleeper into the sleep from which none wake. It was the great gift and the great peril of the cupboard, the one true and certain easer of the worst of pains, and it was given with the most careful and the most trembling hand. We will speak in a moment of the famous sleeping sponge that was made from it, but let us pause first simply upon the flower itself, the scarlet poppy nodding in the summer corn, so frail and so bright and so brief, holding within its little black-hearted head the whole long human story of the easing of pain and the courting of sleep, the mercy and the danger forever bound together in the one slight scarlet flower. The 81st fact is this. The most remarkable of all the medieval medicines for sleep was a thing called the soporific sponge, the sleeping sponge, and it was, in its way, the ancestor of all the anesthesia of the modern operating room. A natural sea sponge was soaked in a strong brew of the most powerful sleep-bringing and pain-killing herbs the age possessed, the opium of the poppy, the juice of the henbane, the mandrake, the hemlock, and others, and then dried hard, when it was needed, before the surgeon set to his dreadful work of the knife or the saw. The dried sponge was moistened again with warm water and held beneath the nose of the patient, who breathed in the rising fumes and sank slowly into a deep insensible sleep, deep enough that the surgeon might cut without the patient feeling the worst of it. It was a dangerous and an uncertain thing, this sleeping sponge, for the dose could not be measured, and the line between the healing sleep and the killing sleep was perilously thin. But it worked often enough, and it stands as a brave and a humane attempt, 600 years and more before the discovery of true anesthesia, to spare the suffering body the full horror of the surgeon's knife. The instinct behind it, that pain is an evil to be eased, and not a punishment to be borne, is one of the gentlest things the old medicine ever reached for. The 82nd fact is this: the henbane, a coarse and clammy and evil-smelling plant of the waster ground and the old wall, with its dull yellow flowers veined in purple, was one of the strong and dangerous herbs of sleep and of the easing of pain, and it was given most carefully for the worst of agonies, and above all for the agony of the aching tooth. There was an old and a curious practice of burning the seeds of the henbane upon a hot iron or a small dish of coals, and having the sufferer hold the open aching mouth in the rising smoke, that the numbing fumes might steal into the tooth and dull the screaming pain. It was believed, too, in the old folk medicine, that small white worms within the tooth were the cause of the toothache, and that the henbane smoke would drive them out, and indeed small white threads were sometimes seen to fall, which were taken for the worms but were in truth only the curling fibres of the burnt seeds. The pain was eased often enough, for the henbane is a true and powerful numbing herb. But it was a dangerous friend, for in any quantity it brought on madness and raving and worse, and the line between the easing of the pain and the loss of the wits was, again, a perilously narrow one. The 83rd fact is this: the mandrake, of all the medieval herbs, was wrapped in the deepest and the strangest cloud of legend, and it deserves a quiet word, for no plant was more feared or more prized. It was a true herb of the sleep and the pain-easing kind, a strong and a narcotic plant, akin to the henbane and the nightshade, and it was used, with great care, in the sleeping draughts and the sleeping sponges. But it was its root, more than its virtue, that made it famous, for the thick forked root of the mandrake, with its splayed branching shape, was thought to look uncannily like the body of a small naked human being, with its trunk and its 2 legs, and sometimes its little arms. And out of this likeness grew a whole forest of legend. The root was said to scream when it was pulled from the ground, a scream so terrible it would kill or madden any who heard it, and so the gatherers were told to tie the plant to a dog and stop their own ears, and let the dog in its straining draw the screaming root from the earth. None of this was true, but the mandrake, half medicine and half monster, root like a tiny human body, growing in the dark earth beneath the gallows, screaming as it was torn free, is one of the unforgettable images the old herbal lore has left us, and it shows how thin, in those days, the wall stood between the garden and the world of dream and terror. The 84th fact is this, and with it we will leave the herbs of sleep. The camomile, that small white and gold apple-scented flower we met long ago among the familiar plants of the garden, comes back to us here at the close of the gentlest chapter, for it was, and is, the very gentlest of all the herbs of the quiet evening, where the poppy and the henbane and the mandrake were strong and dangerous things, to be used with a trembling hand. The chamomile was their mild and harmless little sister, a herb so gentle it might be given freely to the smallest child and the oldest grandmother alike, with never a fear. A warm cup of the chamomile flowers, steeped at the close of the day, eased the stomach and quieted the mind, and softened the edge of the cares of the day, and drew the body, without any danger and without any drug, a little way down toward sleep. It asked nothing and threatened nothing and harmed no one, and it has come down to us, across all the long centuries, entirely unchanged, the same small golden flower in the same warm cup at the same late hour. And if you have ever drunk a cup of it yourself on a wakeful night, then you have shared, exactly, in one of the oldest and the gentlest comforts of the whole medieval world. The 85th fact is this. Let us turn now to the herbs of the heart and the stomach, and we begin with the borage, a rough-leafed plant of the garden with the most beautiful of all blue star-shaped flowers. That was held, above all other herbs, to be the herb of courage and of gladness of heart. There was an old saying, repeated everywhere, that ran, "Borage brings courage," or in the old Latin, "I borage, bring always courage." And the herb was steeped into wine and into cordials and given to lift the heavy and the sorrowful spirit, and to put heart into the faint and the fearful. The bright blue star flowers were floated upon the cup, and candied into sweetmeats, and the whole plant carried, all through the Middle Ages and long after, this reputation as the great gladdener of the heart, the herb that drove away the black melancholy and brought back the cheerful blood. Whether the herb itself truly lifted the spirits is doubtful, but a cup of warm spiced wine with bright blue flowers floating upon it, handed to a sad friend, may have lifted the heart a little by its very kindness and its beauty, and that, in the end, is no small medicine of its own. The 86th fact is this. The hawthorn, the small white-blossomed thorn tree of the spring hedgerow, whose flowers froth like cream along the lanes in the month of May, was held a herb of the heart, and here the old herbalist's instinct and the modern science come, once again, remarkably close together. The medieval and the later herbalist gave the flowers and the dark red berries of the hawthorn for the troubles of the heart, for the heart that beat too fast or too feebly, for the aged heart grown weary in its work. And the modern study of the plant has found that the hawthorn does indeed hold substances that gently strengthen and steady the beating of the heart and ease the flow of the blood, so that the herb is still used in careful preparations for the failing heart of the old to this very day. The hedgerow thorn that the medieval child gathered for a May garland, the same small tree whose blossom was thought half holy and half unlucky to bring within the house, was holding all along, in its frothy white flowers, a true and gentle medicine for the oldest and the wearied heart, which the old herbalists, by long watching, had found, and which we have only confirmed. The 87th fact is this. The lemon balm, a soft-leafed plant of the mint family that smells, when you brush against it, of sweet lemons in the warm sun, was the great herb of good cheer and of the comforting of the heavy heart, and the bees love it so that its very name comes from the old word for the honey bee. The medieval herbalist, and the great nun Hildegard among them, held that the balm gladdened the heart and lifted the spirits and drove away the dark heaviness of melancholy. And it was steeped into a famous cordial water, drunk to comfort the sorrowing and to ease the troubled, and was said even to lengthen the years of those who drank it daily. A warm tea of the lemon balm, taken at the close of a hard day, was thought to soften the cares and quiet the heart. And here again the old use and the new are not so far apart, for the balm is still grown and still steeped and still drunk for exactly this gentle calming of the spirit, one of those quiet, kindly herbs whose whole long history is the easing of the human heart, and whose soft lemon scent, rising from a warm cup, can carry you in an instant out of a hard day and into a summer garden 600 years gone. The 88th fact is this: the ginger root, that knobbed and pungent root of a far eastern plant, was one of the most prized of all the warm spices and warm medicines of the medieval cupboard, and it was given, above all, for the comfort of the cold and the troubled stomach. By the theory of the Humours, the ginger was hot and dry in a high degree, and so it was the very thing for a stomach grown cold and damp and sluggish, to warm it and to wake it, and to set its slow digestion going again. It was given for the cold of the stomach and the wind and the griping, for the queasiness of the traveller and the seasickness of the sailor, candied into a sweetmeat to be carried and nibbled, and worked into the warm spiced wines and the cordials of the cold season. And here once more the old wisdom holds, for the ginger truly does settle the troubled stomach and ease the queasiness, as any traveller who has chewed a piece of crystallized ginger on a tossing boat or a winding road can tell you, so that the medieval remedy for the seasick sailor is almost unchanged. The modern remedy for the carsick child, the same warm pungent root, doing the same warm pungent work across 600 years. The 89th fact is this: the galingale, a root much like the ginger and akin to it, but now half forgotten, was in the Middle Ages one of the most beloved of all the warm aromatic spices, named lovingly in the old poems and the old recipes, prized for the warming of the stomach and the sweetening of the breath and the kindling of the slow digestion. It came from far away, like the ginger and the pepper, along the long spice roads of the East, and it was costly, and it was treasured. We have very largely forgotten it now, in the kitchens of the West, though it lives on still in the cooking of the Far East, where it first grew. But it is worth a moment's quiet remembering, this lost warm spice that our ancestors loved, the galingale, for it stands for the whole great crowd of half-forgotten flavors and half-forgotten medicines that filled the medieval cupboard and the medieval mouth, the tastes that our forebears knew as well as we know cinnamon, and that have slipped almost entirely out of the memory of the world, leaving only their soft old names behind. Scattered through the yellowing pages of the old receipt, books like dried flowers pressed in a book. The 90th fact is this: and with it we will leave the herbs of the heart and the stomach, the mint and the dill and the fennel, the soft green kitchen herbs we met long ago. Come back to us here at the close, for they were the great gentle settlers of the stomach, given freely and without any fear to ease the wind and the griping and the discomfort that comes after a heavy meal or troubles the belly of a fretful child. The dill above all was the herb of the infant's colic, its warm seeds steeped into a gentle water, and given by the spoonful to the crying baby, to ease the small clenched aching belly, and to bring up the trapped wind, and to coax the little one back toward a peaceful sleep. And the very gripe water of the modern nursery, that mothers still keep in the cupboard for the colicky infant, is the direct and almost unchanged descendant of that old dill water of the medieval kitchen. So even the youngest and the smallest of us, in our very first weeks of life, have very likely been eased by a medicine that the medieval mother would have known at a glance, the warm sweet water of the dill, given gently, in the small hours, to a crying child, exactly as it was given 1,000 years ago. Let us turn now to the dangerous and the poisonous plants, used always with the most careful hand. The 91st fact is this: the foxglove, that tall and stately flower of the woodland edge and the cottage garden, with its spire of nodding purple bells, each freckled within like the throat of a wild thing, is one of the most beautiful and one of the most deadly of all the plants of the European countryside. And the medieval herbalist knew its danger well, and used it, when at all, with the greatest care. It is a true and a powerful poison, and a child who eats of its leaves or its flowers may sicken and die, and the medieval folk knew this, and warned of it, and kept it at a wary distance. And yet within that very danger lay hidden, all unknown to the medieval mind, the single greatest medical gift the whole long story of the herbal would ever give to the world, for the foxglove holds, in its poisonous leaves, a substance of astonishing power over the failing human heart, a thing the herbalists half sensed and never understood, and that would not be truly grasped for centuries yet. We will come to the unfolding of that great secret at the very end of our walk tonight. For now, let it stand simply as the chief of the dangerous beauties, the lovely poison of the woodland, holding its great secret close within its freckled purple bells. The 92nd fact is this: the hemlock, a tall plant of the ditch and the damp wayside, with its ferny leaves and its little umbels of small white flowers, and its smooth purple spotted stem, is among the deadliest of all the plants of Europe, and it has a long and a terrible fame. For it was the very poison by which the ancient philosopher Socrates was put to death, made to drink the cup of hemlock by the judges of Athens. The medieval herbalist knew it for the deadly thing it was, and feared it, and yet did not leave it entirely alone, for in the smallest and the most careful of doses, applied outwardly upon the skin, or used in the great sleeping draughts, its very deadliness, its power to numb and to still, could be turned, with the most trembling of hands, toward the easing of pain. It was one of the herbs of the sleeping sponge, but it was a herb to be approached as one approaches a sleeping serpent, with the utmost care and the lightest of touches, for it does not warm or stimulate as it kills, but cools and stills and stops, creeping up the body from the feet until the breath itself grows quiet and ceases. The line between its medicine and its murder was thinner, perhaps, than for any other plant in the whole cupboard. The 93rd fact is this: the deadly nightshade, whose very name carries its warning, is a plant of dark and dangerous beauty, with dull purple bell flowers and, later, berries of a glossy black that are sweet to the taste, and deadly to the child who eats them, for which reason it earned its other name, the dwale, and the names of death. Its second famous name, Belladonna, the beautiful lady, comes from a strange and a vain old use, for the ladies of certain times and places would put a drop of its juice into their eyes, which widened and darkened the pupil, and gave the eye a large and lustrous look thought to be beautiful, though it dimmed the sight and harmed the eye, and was a foolish and a dangerous vanity. The medieval herbalist used the deadly nightshade, like the hemlock and the henbane, among the strong sleep-bringing and pain-easing herbs, in the smallest and most careful of doses, and feared it greatly, and well he might. And here again, as with the foxglove, the modern science of medicine has found within the deadly poison a true and useful drug, drawn carefully from the very plant that kills, and used to this day in the easing of pain and the widening of the eye for the doctor's examination. The old vanity turned, at last, to a true and gentle use. The 94th fact is this: the monkshood, also called the wolfsbane or the aconite, is perhaps the single most deadly plant in all of Europe, a tall and a beautiful flower of the high meadow and the cottage garden, with its hooded blooms of the deepest blue violet, shaped like a monk's drawn cowl, from which it takes its name. So deadly is it that the poison can pass even through the unbroken skin, and the gatherers of old were warned never to handle its root with a bare and a cut hand. The medieval herbalist named it the queen of poisons, and used it scarcely and fearfully if at all, more often warning against it than reaching for it, for there is very little safe ground between its dose as a medicine and its dose as a death. Its old name of wolfsbane comes from its darkest use, for it was smeared upon the bait and the arrow to kill the wolf and other beasts of prey. It stands, in our chapter of the dangerous plants, as the very furthest edge. The plant whose beauty is most perfectly matched by its deadliness, the deep blue hooded flower nodding so innocently in the summer border, holding within it a death so swift and so certain that the wisest of the old herbalists, for the most part, simply let it be and grew it only for its beauty, and kept their careful hands well away. The 95th fact is this, and with it we will leave the dangerous plants. There runs through this whole dark chapter one great quiet truth, which the careful apothecary understood in his bones long before any philosopher set it down in plain words, and it is this, that there is no sharp line in all of nature between the medicine and the poison, but only the question of the dose. The same poppy that eases the worst of pains in a careful measure will kill in a careless one. The same foxglove that may one day steady a failing heart will stop a sound one. The same deadly nightshade that blinds and kills holds within it a true and useful drug. It is not that some plants are medicines and others are poisons. It is that very nearly every strong plant is both at once, and that all the art and all the care of the healer lies in the finding and the keeping of the narrow, safe path between. A physician of a later age, Paracelsus, would one day say it plainly, that the dose alone makes a thing a poison or a cure. But the medieval apothecary, weighing out his henbane and his poppy with a trembling and a careful hand, his eye upon the small bright pan of the balance, knew the whole of that truth already, in his fingers and his fear, 3 full centuries before anyone thought to write it down. Let us turn now to the herbs that lived a double life, in the kitchen and in the physic both. The 96th fact is this: the medieval mind drew no clear line at all between the food and the medicine, between the herb that flavored the supper and the herb that healed the sick, and this is one of the deepest and the most important things to understand about the whole old way of healing. The very same sage that seasoned the roast was the sage that was given for the failing memory. The very same mint that flavored the sauce was the mint that settled the troubled stomach. The very same garlic that sharpened the pottage was the garlic that was held a guard against infection and a cleanser of the blood. Every meal was, in a quiet way, a kind of medicine, chosen and balanced according to the same theory of the hot and the cold, the wet and the dry, that governed the sick room, and the cook and the healer were, very often, the very same person, working at the very same hearth, with the very same herbs. To eat well, in the medieval understanding, was already to be physicked, and the great pot of pottage simmering on the fire, thick with its handful of green herbs, was at once the family's supper and the family's daily dose of gentle medicine, the two things wholly woven together, as they had always been, and as, in our own age of the pill and the supplement, we are slowly and half-consciously beginning once more to remember that they are. The 97th fact is this: the pottage, that great thick simmering pot of grain and beans and vegetables and herbs, that was the daily food of nearly every medieval household, poor and rich alike, was thickened and flavored and quietly medicined with a handful of green herbs gathered fresh from the garden or the hedge, and these were known simply as the pot herbs. The parsley and the leek, the borage and the orach, the good King Henry and the Alexanders, and a dozen more humble green things went into the pot, and they were chosen not only for their savour, but for their virtue. The cooling herb in the heat of the summer, the warming herb in the cold of the winter, so that the whole turning year was eaten, herb by herb, in the changing pottage of the seasons. There was nothing grand in it, no costly spice from the far east, no rare drug from the apothecary's jar, only the common green herbs of the dooryard and the ditch, gathered by the good wife and dropped into the pot. And yet in that humble daily pottage, eaten by countless millions over countless years, lay the true broad foundation of all the people's health, the quiet green medicine of the everyday, far more important, in the long sum of things, than all the rare theriacs and pomanders of the rich. The 98th fact is this, and with it we will leave the kitchen. There was a whole class of herbs grown and gathered not to be eaten at all, nor quite to be taken as medicine, but to be strewn upon the floor. And these were the strewing herbs, and they were a true part of the medieval care of health, though we should hardly think of them so today. The floors of the medieval hall and cottage and church were of beaten earth or of stone, often cold and often foul, and upon them were strewn the fresh green herbs and rushes, the sweet flag and the meadowsweet, the lavender and the chamomile, and the tansy and the mint, to be crushed underfoot, and to release their sweet scent, to cover the smells of the close crowded living, and to drive off, it was believed, the fleas and the vermin, and the corrupted airs that brought disease. The meadowsweet was beloved above all for this, for its scent grows sweeter, not weaker. As it dries and is trodden, and a Queen of England, it is said, chose it above all herbs to be strewn in her chambers. It was a humble thing, this strewing of herbs upon the floor, half housekeeping and half medicine, and yet it filled the medieval room with the green scent of the meadow, and kept down, in its modest way, the small biting plagues of the close medieval life. There is one more thing worth saying, And it is the best thing of all, before we come at last to the close of our long walk tonight. We have spoken so often, through this whole quiet evening, of how much the medieval herbalist got wrong, the humours and the signatures, and the charms and the rest. Let us end, then, not with what they got wrong, but with the two greatest things they got right. The two plants whose old uses ran on, unbroken, straight out of the medieval garden, and into the very heart of the modern science of medicine, the bright thread that ties the candlelit shop of our story to the bright pharmacy of the present day. Let us turn now to the survival of the old lore into the medicine of our own time. The 99th fact is this. We come back, at the very last, to the foxglove, the lovely poison of the woodland, the chief of all our dangerous beauties. For centuries the country herb wives had used it, carefully and half secretly, in their remedies, and among the country folk of England there lingered an old quiet knowledge that the foxglove was somehow good for a certain kind of swelling and breathlessness. The dropsy, as they called it, the watery swelling of the body that comes, though they did not know it, when the heart begins to fail and the fluid gathers in the flesh. In the later years of the 18th century, a careful English doctor named William Withering heard of an old country woman, a herb wife of Shropshire, who could cure the dropsy with a secret family recipe of many herbs when the learned doctors had given the sufferer up for lost. And being a wise man, he did not laugh at the old woman, but studied her recipe, and picked it apart herb by herb, and found that the one herb in it that truly worked, the active heart of the whole old country cure, was the foxglove. He spent 10 patient years studying it, learning its dose, learning its danger, and in the year 1785 he published his careful account of it, and so the old herb wife's secret became, at last, a true and measured medicine of the modern world, the drug we now call digitalis, drawn from the foxglove still, and given to this very day to steady and to strengthen the failing human heart. The whole great river of modern heart medicine has, at its distant source, an old woman in a cottage in Shropshire, and behind her, the countless nameless wise women of the Middle Ages who had known, without knowing why, that the lovely purple poison of the woodland was somehow a friend to the failing heart. The 100th fact, the last of all our 100, is this. Along the streams and the wet meadows of medieval Europe there grew, and grows still, a tall plant of frothy creamy flowers and a sweet honeyed scent, the meadow sweet, that we met among the strewing herbs, beloved for the sweetening of the medieval floor. And there grew too, by every riverside, the willow, the graceful tree that trails its long leaves in the slow water. From the earliest times, the herbalists had known that the bitter bark of the willow, chewed or steeped into a drink, would ease a pain and cool a fever, and the meadow sweet too was given for the aching joint and the feverish heat. They did not know why, but in the 19th century, the chemists of the new science took up these two old fever herbs, the willow and the meadow sweet, and drew out from them the bitter substance that did the work, and studied it, and refined it, and gentled its harshness upon the stomach, until at last, in the closing years of that century, they had made from it a small white powder, a medicine to ease the pain and cool the fever of the whole world. And they gave it a name, and the name they gave it, the most used medicine in all the history of the earth, came in part from the old botanical name of that frothy, creamy meadowsweet, the medieval strewing herb of the sweetened floor. The medicine is aspirin, and so the very last of our 100 facts is perhaps the most wonderful of all, that the small white pill in the modern cupboard, that nearly every person now alive has swallowed at some time against a headache, or a fever, or an aching limb, is the direct and lineal descendant of two humble medieval herbs, the bitter willow of the riverbank and the sweet meadowsweet of the strewn medieval floor, and that the longest and the brightest thread in all the long story of the herbs runs straight from the candlelit cottage of the medieval wise woman to the bathroom cabinet of the present day, unbroken after 1,000 years. And there our 100 facts are ended. Let us come back now, slowly, to the small warm shop where we began on the cold winter night, with the candle burning low upon the counter and the fire glowing red upon the hearth. The night is very deep now beyond the small horn windows, and the frost has thickened upon the glass, and the lane outside is silent under the stars. The young mother sleeps now in the warm corner by the fire, her child sleeping soundly against her, the small fever broken at last, the small face cool and peaceful in the candlelight. The carter sleeps too, his head against the warm stone of the chimney, his great cloak dry at last and steaming faintly in the heat. And the old apothecary moves quietly about his shop in the last of the candlelight, as he has done every night of his long life, lifting down a jar here and setting one straight there, his slow, careful hands moving among the rows of his medicines, as gently as a shepherd among his flock in the dark. He banks the fire now, raking the red embers together and covering them softly with ash, that they may hold their warmth until the morning. He lifts down one last small jar from the shelf, the chamomile, the gentlest of all his herbs, and shakes a little of the dried golden flowers into a wooden bowl and pours upon them the last of the warm water from the small iron pot, and the soft apple sweetness rises one last time into the warm dark air of the room. He sets the bowl upon the counter to cool, in case the child should wake in the night and need it, and then he sits down at last upon his stool by the banked fire, and folds his careful hands in his lap, and lets his own tired eyes fall half closed, and listens to the soft breathing of his sleeping guests, and the soft settling of the embers, and the great silence of the frozen night beyond the walls. You do not need to remember any of the 100 facts we have spoken tonight. Not one of them. Let them go now, gently all of them, the monastery garden and the 4 humours, the old books and the wise women, the doctrine of signatures and the dark remedies against the plague, the herbs of sleep and of the heart, the dangerous beauties, and the bright unbroken thread that runs down to our own day. Let them all drift away from you now, like the last of the smoke rising from the banked fire, like the last of the steam rising from the cooling bowl, up into the dark and away. They were only ever a thing to drift to sleep upon, a long quiet murmur of old green things in the warm dark, and they have done their work if they have carried you gently down toward the edge of sleep. The candle is very low now. The flame leans and gutters and steadies one last time. The apothecary's eyes are closed. The child sleeps. The fire is warm. There is nothing more tonight that asks anything of you, and nothing left to do, and nowhere you need to be, but exactly where you are, warm and still and quiet, at the close of the long day. Let your breath grow slow and even, like the breathing of the sleepers by the fire. Let the shoulders soften and the hands grow still, and the long day fall away behind you, like the cold lane falling away behind a traveler who has come, at last, in out of the dark, to a warm room and a low fire and a quiet bed. The herbs are hung in their bunches from the dark beams overhead. The jars stand in their quiet rows upon the shelf. The fire is banked, and the door is barred, and the night is keeping its long, slow watch over all of it and over you. Sleep now. There is all the night before you, and nothing in it but rest. From all of us here at the quiet apothecary, by the low fire and the dying candle, on this cold and quiet and peaceful night, sleep well and sleep deeply, and let the warm dark gather you softly in. Good night, good night. Sleep now, and let the candle go out, and let the long night carry you gently down into rest.